The earthquake cracked the walls of my apartment, but my parents' words would soon break me completely. When a massive tremor destroyed my home, I begged my mother for a spot on her sofa for my freezing 5-year-old son. She looked at me with cold eyes and said my sister needed the guest room for her extra luggage. I slept in my car with my little boy wrapped in a single damp blanket. But by the next morning, a forgotten steel box hidden in a basement would reveal a property deed that proved who truly owned their multi-million-dollar mansion. My name is Chloe, I am 32 years old, and this is the story of how I stopped begging for love and took my life back. The nightmare began at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, staring blindly at a glowing laptop screen. As a freelance accountant, my work never truly ended. I was balancing the quarterly books for a local plumbing company, my eyes burning from exhaustion. I regularly worked 14 hours a day, just to keep a roof over my son's head and food in our tiny pantry. My 5-year-old son Leo was fast asleep in his bedroom, just a few feet down the narrow hallway. It was a quiet, ordinary night in our modest Southern California suburb, and then the ground began to roar. It did not start with a shake. It started with a sound like a freight train rushing directly beneath the floorboards. Before my mind could even process the noise, the entire apartment violently lurched to the right. My coffee mug flew off the table and shattered against the refrigerator. The kitchen cabinets flew open, spilling heavy ceramic plates and glass bowls onto the linoleum floor with deafening crashes. I was thrown from my chair, my knees slamming hard against the ground. Panic, raw and suffocating, seized my throat. I scrambled to my feet, but the floor rolled in violent, unpredictable waves, knocking me back down. It was a 6.5 magnitude earthquake, the kind that rips foundations apart and shatters lives in seconds. I crawled on my hands and knees down the hallway. The drywall around me was screaming, splitting open, with loud cracking noises. Long, jagged lines of darkness appeared in the white paint. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating my hair and stinging my eyes. I reached Leo's bedroom door, just as his bookshelf toppled over, narrowly missing his small bed. I grabbed him, pulling his warm, terrified little body into my chest. He was crying, his small hands gripping my shirt so tightly it hurt. I dragged us underneath the sturdy wooden frame of his bedroom door, curling my body entirely over his to protect him from the falling debris. We stayed there, huddled together on the shaking floor, as the world around us tore itself apart. The violent shaking lasted for nearly a minute, but trapped in that doorway, with my sobbing child, it felt like an eternity. When the ground finally stopped moving, an eerie, terrifying silence fell over the apartment. It was immediately followed by the blaring of car alarms outside and the distant wailing of sirens. The power was completely out. We were bathed in absolute darkness, breathing in the thick, chalky scent of pulverized drywall. I found my phone on the floor and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated total destruction. The large crack in my living room wall was wide enough for me to fit my hand inside. The structural beam near the kitchen looked twisted, sagging dangerously under the weight of the roof. Heavy boots pounded up the exterior stairs of our apartment complex. Flashlights swept across the broken windows. A police officer pounded on my front door, his voice muffled but urgent, shouting for everyone to evacuate the building immediately. The structure was compromised. We had to get out right that second. I had no time to think. I grabbed an old canvas backpack from the closet and began throwing things inside with frantic, trembling hands. I grabbed Leo's dinosaur pajamas, a pair of warm socks, a box of granola bars, and my laptop. My laptop was my entire livelihood. If I lost that, I lost my clients, and if I lost my clients, we would truly starve. I wrapped Leo in his thickest jacket, pulled my own coat over my shoulders, and hurried out the front door. Outside, the scene was absolute chaos. Red and blue emergency lights flashed across the frightened faces of my neighbors. Firefighters were cordoning off the building with bright yellow tape. I stood on the cracked concrete sidewalk, holding Leo tightly against my hip, and watched a city building inspector walk up to my front door. He held a bright red piece of paper. He slapped the red tag directly onto the wood of my door. I knew exactly what a red tag meant. The building was structurally unsafe. No one was allowed back inside. We were effectively homeless. The night air was bitterly cold. Southern California nights can drop to 40 degrees in the early spring, and the biting wind whipped through our thin jackets. Leo buried his face in my neck, his little body shivering violently. I hurried us to my car, a 10-year-old Honda Civic parked on the street. Miraculously, the streetlights had missed it when they fell. I buckled Leo into his car seat, wrapped a damp fleece blanket from the trunk around his legs, and climbed into the driver's seat. I locked the doors and turned on the engine, blasting the heater to warm his freezing hands. I pulled out my phone and checked my bank app. $34.50. That was my entire net worth, until a client's invoice cleared next Friday. I could not afford a hotel room. Even if I could, every motel within a 50-mile radius was already turning people away, their parking lots overflowing with other displaced families. Sitting in that cold car, staring at the flashing police lights, illuminating the ruins of my life, the bitter reality of my situation crushed the breath out of me. I had absolutely no safety net. I had worked myself to the bone, taking on every grueling accounting job I could find, sacrificing sleep and meals just to maintain our independence. I had done it all to avoid one specific thing. I had done it to avoid asking my parents for help. My parents, Richard and Susan, were incredibly wealthy. They lived in a pristine, luxurious 5-bedroom mansion in a highly exclusive gated community just 40 minutes away. Their neighborhood was a fortress of privilege, with perfectly manicured lawns, towering oak trees, and private security guards. But their wealth, their comfort, and their generosity had never extended to me. Growing up, I was the invisible child. I was the scapegoat, the convenient punching bag for my mother's frustrations and my father's cold indifference. I was expected to be entirely self-sufficient from the moment I could walk. If I needed new shoes for school, I was told to find a part-time job and learn the value of $1. If I struggled with a math test, I was told I was lazy and ungrateful. But my younger sister, Jessica, lived an entirely different life in the exact same house. Jessica was the golden child. She had my mother's bright smile and my father's manipulative charm. Jessica never worked a single day in her life. Richard and Susan paid for her designer clothes, her luxury vacations, and her expensive private college education that she ultimately dropped out of. When Jessica married Brad, a man just as entitled and unemployed as she was, my parents paid for a lavish $80,000 wedding without batting an eye. For years, I watched my parents pour endless financial and emotional support into Jessica while demanding absolute perfection and silence from me. When I became a single mother, I reached out to them once, just once, asking for a small loan to cover Leo's medical bills when he had a severe respiratory infection. My mother had laughed over the phone, telling me that my poor life choices were not her financial burden. She told me I needed to figure it out like a responsible adult. The next week, she bought Jessica a brand new luxury SUV simply because Jessica complained her old car was the wrong shade of white. I never asked them for a single dime again. I built my freelance accounting business from the ground up, fighting for every single dollar, determined to give Leo a life filled with love, even if we did not have luxury. I promised myself I would never stand on their massive front porch and beg for their mercy again. But as another violent aftershock rattled my small car, Leo let out a terrified cry in the back seat. I looked at him through the rearview mirror. His lips were trembling from the cold. He was exhausted, frightened, and completely dependent on me. My pride did not matter anymore. My independence did not matter. My son was freezing in a car in the middle of a disaster zone. And I had exactly one place left to go. I shifted the car into drive and carefully navigated around the fallen debris in the street. The drive toward my parents' wealthy neighborhood was a journey through a broken city. Traffic lights were dead. Power lines snaked across the asphalt. The radio buzzed with emergency broadcasts, warning residents to stay off the roads and seek immediate shelter. I kept a steady stream of comforting words flowing to the back seat. I told Leo we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's house. I told him they had a big fireplace and warm beds and that everything was going to be perfectly fine. I spoke the words with a confident smile, but my stomach twisted into tight, painful knots. I knew exactly who my mother was. I knew my father's cold, judgmental stare. I knew stepping into their world meant willingly walking into a trap of emotional abuse. But this was an extreme emergency. A natural disaster had just destroyed my home. Surely even Richard and Susan would not turn away their own freezing grandson in the middle of the night. After 40 agonizing minutes of navigating dark, broken streets, I reached the entrance to their gated community. The massive iron gates had been locked open due to the power outage. As I drove up the winding, perfectly paved roads, the destruction of the city faded away. The houses here were built like fortresses engineered to withstand anything. The lawns were undisturbed. The grand facade stood tall and unbroken. I pulled my dented, dusty Honda Civic onto my parents' expansive cobblestone driveway. The mansion loomed ahead of us, 3 stories of elegant stone and massive glass windows. The house had a backup generator. Warm golden light spilled from the front windows, painting the driveway in a soft, inviting glow. I parked right next to Brad's expensive sports car and Jessica's massive luxury SUV. They were already here. Of course they were. Whenever anything slightly inconvenient happened, Jessica ran straight to Richard and Susan to be coddled. I turned off the engine. The silence inside the car was heavy. I unbuckled Leo, lifting his shivering body into my arms. He buried his cold face into my shoulder. I walked up the long stone pathway toward the towering oak front door. With every step, my heart hammered violently against my ribs. I was a 32-year-old woman, a professional accountant, a mother who fought daily for her independence, yet walking up those steps, I felt like that discarded, worthless child all over again. I stood on the massive front porch. I reached out a trembling hand and pressed the glowing doorbell. I held my freezing son tightly against my chest, waiting for the door to open, completely unaware that the betrayal waiting for me on the other side of that wood would permanently destroy our family and force me to finally fight back. I stood on the massive stone porch of my parents' estate, holding my 5-year-old son against my chest. The wind whipped around us, slicing through our thin jackets. Leo was shivering so violently that his teeth chattered against my collarbone. I pressed the glowing doorbell and listened to the soft, melodic chime echo deep inside the house. Through the frosted glass panels, I could see the warm golden light of the foyer chandeliers. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing. It sounded safe. It sounded like everything we had just lost. I waited. The cold was seeping into my bones. My legs ached from crawling on the floor of my ruined apartment just an hour earlier. I pressed the doorbell a second time. My heart hammered against my ribs with a mixture of desperate hope and deeply ingrained fear. I just needed a corner of a room for my son, just a few blankets and a safe floor where the ceiling would not collapse on us. Footsteps finally approached. The heavy oak door swung inward. The warmth of the house rushed out to greet us, carrying the familiar scent of my mother's expensive lavender perfume and roasted cinnamon. For a split second, I felt a wave of profound relief. But the relief died the moment I looked at my mother's face. Susan Myers did not look concerned. She did not look worried. She stood in the doorway wearing a pristine cashmere sweater and silk lounge pants, looking deeply annoyed. She crossed her arms over her chest and looked at me as if I were a stranger selling magazines at an inconvenient hour. "Chloe," she said, her voice completely devoid of warmth. "What on earth are you doing here at this time of night?" "Mom!" I gasped, my voice cracking from the cold and the residual terror of the earthquake. Our building was hit. It was hit hard. The walls cracked open. The city inspector Red tagged the entire complex. We had to evacuate. We have nowhere else to go. I shifted Leo in my arms, hoping she would see his pale face, hoping her maternal instincts would finally override her lifelong disdain for me. "Mom, it is freezing out here. Please let us in." My mother did not step aside. She kept one hand firmly on the brass doorknob, actively blocking the entrance. She looked past me, scanning the dark driveway, before bringing her cold eyes back to my face. "I heard about the earthquake on the news," she said casually, as if discussing a mild change in the weather. "It was a terrible shake. But Chloe, you really should have called first before just showing up unannounced." "Called first," I repeated the words, tasting their absurdity. "Mom, the power lines are down. The cell towers are completely jammed. We barely made it out of the apartment before the roof started sagging. We lost everything tonight. My mother let out a long, exasperated sigh. The sound was like a physical blow. It was the exact same sigh she used when I was a teenager, asking for help with college applications. It was the sound of a woman being burdened by an unwanted responsibility. "I am sorry you are dealing with that, Chloe," she said, her tone flat and clinical. "But you cannot stay here tonight. There is simply no room." No room. I stared at her in utter disbelief. "Mom, you live in a 6,000 square foot house. You have 5 bedrooms. You have a massive finished basement. What do you mean there is no room?" "Jessica and Brad are here," she said, her voice suddenly turning protective and defensive. The earthquake knocked out the power grid in their neighborhood, and their central air conditioning system completely shut down. Jessica was absolutely sweltering. You know how sensitive she is to the heat. They needed a comfortable place to sleep, so they took both of the guest rooms. Brad uses the second one for his snoring. They are already settled in, and I am not going to wake them up. I stood there on the freezing porch, staring at the woman who gave birth to me. My mind desperately tried to process the sheer cruelty of her logic. My sister and her unemployed husband were sleeping in 2 separate luxury guest rooms because their air conditioning was broken. Meanwhile, my son and I were standing on the doorstep, shivering in the 40-degree wind because our home had literally crumbled around us. "Mom," I whispered, my voice breaking completely. "Are you listening to yourself right now? We do not need a guest room. We do not need a bed. We just need the floor. Let us sleep on the living room sofa. Let us sleep on the rug in the den. Leo is 5 years old. He is freezing. Please do not turn your grandson away in the middle of the night." Leo whimpered against my neck, tightening his small arms around me. "Grandma," he mumbled, his voice weak and raspy. "I am so cold." I looked at my mother, expecting to see a crack in her armor, expecting to see an ounce of human decency. Instead, her jaw tightened. Her eyes narrowed into thin, sharp slits of irritation. "Chloe, do not use your child to manipulate me," she snapped, her voice dropping to a harsh, angry whisper. "I am not going to have you camping out in my living room like vagrants. What if the neighbors see you sleeping on the floor through the windows? What will people think? Jessica is already traumatized enough by the power outage at her house. She needs a calm, peaceful environment to recover. Having you and a crying child in the house is just going to cause unnecessary drama." Traumatized by a power outage, I asked, the anger finally rising up through my despair. "Mom, our walls split open. We almost died tonight." "You are always so dramatic," she interrupted, raising her hand to silence me. "Always making everything a massive crisis. You chose to live in that cheap apartment building. You chose to struggle. I told you years ago you needed to find a better job and a better husband, but you never listen. Now you want to dump your problems on my doorstep." I felt a tear slip down my freezing cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, unfiltered rage. For my entire life, I had blamed myself for her lack of love. I had spent 32 years thinking I was not smart enough or successful enough to earn a place in this family. But looking at her standing in the warm glow of her multi-million-dollar mansion, prioritizing her golden child's air conditioning over her grandson's safety, I finally saw the truth. It was never about me. She was simply a deeply broken, selfish woman who was completely incapable of love. "There are emergency shelters opening up downtown," she continued, waving her hand toward the dark street. "Or you can find a cheap motel. You are a resourceful girl, Chloe. You have always been good at figuring things out on your own. Now please, I need to get back inside. Brad has an important investment meeting tomorrow, and I am making them an early breakfast." She began to close the door. "Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, dead whisper. "If you close this door right now, I promise you I will never knock on it again." Her expression did not change. She did not hesitate. "Good night, Chloe," she said. "Figure it out." The heavy oak door slammed shut. The solid thud echoed through the quiet, wealthy neighborhood. A second later, I heard the sharp metallic click of the deadbolt locking into place. I stood on the stone porch for a long time, listening to the wind rustle through the perfectly manicured oak trees. My arms were trembling from the weight of holding Leo, and the biting cold was turning my fingers completely numb. I looked at the grand, beautiful house. Through the large front window, I could see the massive leather sofa sitting empty in front of the stone fireplace. It was right there. Warmth and safety were right there, separated from us by a few inches of wood and glass and a lifetime of cruelty. I turned around and walked back down the long driveway. My shoes crunched against the cobblestones. The walk back to my car felt like the longest walk of my entire life. I reached the 10-year-old Honda Civic parked near the curb. I opened the back door and carefully placed Leo into his car seat. I wrapped the damp fleece blanket tightly around his small body, tucking the edges under his arms to trap whatever heat was left. "Mommy," he asked, his voice trembling. "Why did Grandma lock the door? Did we do something bad?" The innocence in his question shattered my heart into a million tiny pieces. I leaned into the back seat, pressing my forehead against his cold cheek. "No, baby," I whispered, fighting back a sob. "We did not do anything bad. Grandma is just very confused right now. But we are going to be okay. I promise you we are going to be okay." I closed the back door and climbed into the driver's seat. The inside of the car felt like an icebox. The windows were already fogging up from our breath. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. I turned the heater up to its highest setting, aiming the vents toward the back seat to push the warm air toward Leo. I looked at the fuel gauge. The bright orange needle was hovering dangerously close to the empty line. I had less than a quarter tank of gas. If I kept the engine running all night, we would run out of fuel long before the sun came up, and I would not be able to drive us anywhere in the morning. I had to make a choice. We could not drive around aimlessly searching for a motel I could not afford. We could not risk getting stranded on the side of a dark road. We were stuck. I let the engine run for exactly 15 minutes, just long enough to take the worst of the chill out of the air. Then I reached forward and turned the key backward. The engine cut out. The heater stopped blowing. The heavy, terrifying silence of the night rushed back into the car. I reclined the driver's seat as far back as it would go. I pulled my thin coat tightly around my chest, crossing my arms to preserve my body heat. Outside, the wind howled violently against the windows, rocking the small car back and forth. We were sleeping in a freezing, compact car parked directly on the driveway of a massive 5-bedroom mansion. I turned my head and looked through the passenger window. The house stood there mocking me. The golden light from the foyer eventually clicked off, plunging the property into absolute darkness. My parents were going to sleep in their expensive king-sized beds under down comforters. Jessica and Brad were resting in luxury guest rooms because their house was too warm. And I was sitting in the freezing dark, listening to the rhythmic chattering of my son's teeth. The physical discomfort was agonizing, but the emotional betrayal burned far hotter than the cold. Every hour that passed felt like a physical blow. At 2 a.m, the temperature dropped again. The inside of the windshield began to collect a thin layer of frost. I unbuckled my seatbelt, climbed carefully into the cramped back seat, and wrapped my body completely around Leo. I pulled him against my chest, trying to act as a human shield against the freezing air. He whimpered in his sleep, pressing his icy face into my neck. I held him tighter, rocking him gently back and forth in the darkness. In that freezing, cramped space, a profound transformation happened inside of me. The desperate daughter who had always craved her parents' approval died on that driveway. The woman who made excuses for their cruelty, the woman who believed she deserved to be treated like garbage, simply vanished. In her place, something entirely new was born. It was a cold, sharp, and unbreakable resolve. I stared at the dark silhouette of my parents' mansion through the frosted window. They had finally shown me exactly who they were. They had proven that their luxury and their comfort meant more to them than the life of my child. They had chosen their golden daughter over my basic survival. I made a silent promise to my sleeping son, right there in the dark. I promised him that I would never allow anyone to treat us like this ever again. I promised him that we would survive this night and that by tomorrow I would figure out a way to build us a life completely free from their toxic shadow. I did not sleep a single minute that night. I stayed awake listening to the wind, holding my son, and letting the pure, unadulterated rage burn away every last ounce of weakness in my body. I watched the sky slowly turn from pitch black to a deep, bruising purple. I did not know it yet, but the morning was going to bring a discovery that would permanently change the power dynamic of our family. I was sitting in my freezing car, completely unaware that the mansion looming over us did not actually belong to the people sleeping inside it. I was unaware that a forgotten piece of paper was waiting in the darkness to rewrite our entire future. As the first rays of morning light hit the frosted windshield of my Honda Civic, I took a deep breath. The night of suffering was over. The era of fighting back was about to begin. The clock on my dashboard glared back at me in harsh digital green. 4 a.m. The temperature had plummeted drastically over the last 2 hours, transforming the inside of my 10-year-old Honda Civic into a genuine icebox. The damp fleece blanket I had wrapped around Leo was completely useless against the biting Southern California frost that was now forming on the inside of the windows. Every breath we took plumed in the freezing air like thick white smoke. My sweet 5-year-old boy was no longer just shivering. He was sobbing. It was a weak, breathless sound that tore right through my chest and shattered my heart into pieces. His lips had taken on a terrifying pale blue hue. His tiny fingers clutching the fabric of my jacket were stiff and freezing to the touch. He buried his face deeper into my collarbone, whimpering that the cold was hurting him. As a mother, there is no sound more devastating than the cry of your child suffering when you are entirely powerless to stop it. I rubbed his arms frantically, trying to generate friction, trying to transfer whatever meager body heat I had left into his small, fragile frame. But I was freezing too. My joints ached, my teeth chattered so hard, my jaw throbbed, and a dark, suffocating panic was beginning to set in. We could not survive until sunrise in this car. Hypothermia was a very real, immediate threat. I looked out the frosted passenger window at the massive dark silhouette of my parents' mansion. Just 50 feet away, Richard and Susan were fast asleep in their luxurious temperature-controlled fortress. My sister Jessica and her husband Brad were stretched out on expensive mattresses in plush guest rooms. They had locked us out in the freezing aftermath of an earthquake because our basic survival was too much of an inconvenience to their comfort. The sheer, unfathomable cruelty of it made my blood boil. It was a physical rage, hot and sharp, cutting through the numbness in my limbs. I could not just sit here and watch my son suffer. I had to do something. I racked my brain desperately, trying to think of a solution. I could not break a window. The alarm system would instantly trigger, and Richard would undoubtedly call the police on his own daughter. Then a sudden memory flashed through my mind, bright and urgent. I reached for my purse in the passenger seat and dug out my heavy keyring. My fingers were so incredibly stiff from the cold that I could barely separate the metal keys. I pushed past my apartment key and my car key, searching blindly in the dark. There, tucked quietly at the very back of the ring, was a small tarnished brass key. It was a relic from a lifetime ago. Back when I was a teenager working late shifts at a local diner to pay for my own school supplies, Susan would maliciously lock the front door at exactly 10 o'clock at night. If I was even 1 minute late, I was left out on the porch for the entire night. But my grandfather William, my father's dad, had lived with us during those years. He was the only person in that sprawling, toxic house who ever showed me an ounce of genuine warmth and love. He had quietly slipped this brass key into my hand one evening after my mother had locked me out. I remembered him pressing his warm, calloused fingers over mine in the dark. He whispered that it was a key to the basement side door, and he told me to never let them leave me out in the cold again. Grandfather William had passed away 10 years ago. When he died, the very last shred of love in this family died with him. But I had never taken that key off my ring. It was the only piece of him I carried with me. And tonight, 10 years after his death, Grandfather William was going to save us from the cold one more time. I looked down at Leo. He had finally exhausted himself into a fitful, shivering sleep, his breathing dangerously shallow. I tucked the edges of the damp blanket firmly around his shoulders. I leaned down and kissed his freezing forehead, promising him in a whisper that Mommy was going to get us something warm. I quietly opened the car door, wincing as the bitter wind hit my face like a physical blow. I stepped onto the cobblestone driveway and silently closed the door behind me, double-checking to make sure it was locked. I moved quickly and carefully, keeping my head down my shoes, crunching softly over the frost-covered grass. The mansion was completely silent, a towering monument to greed and selfishness. I crept along the side of the massive stone house, staying close to the brick foundation to avoid triggering the motion sensor security lights. The shadows were deep here, masking my movements from the street. I reached the narrow concrete stairwell that led down to the basement entrance. The stairs were slick with a thin, dangerous layer of ice, and I had to grip the freezing metal handrail to keep from slipping and breaking an ankle. At the bottom of the stairwell, I stood before the heavy wooden door. I held my breath, praying silently that Richard had not changed the lock in the 15 years since I had last used it. My hands shook violently as I slid the old brass key into the keyhole. It resisted at first, the metal grinding harshly against rusted tumblers. Panic flared in my chest. I applied a little more pressure, wiggling the key back and forth with desperate strength. With a loud, stiff click that echoed terrifyingly in the quiet night, the lock turned. I pushed the door open. The hinges groaned a slow, agonizing protest. I froze instantly, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for a light to flick on upstairs, waiting for the sound of my father's heavy footsteps thundering down to investigate. But the house remained completely silent. I slipped inside and gently pulled the heavy door shut behind me, plunging myself into absolute darkness. The basement air was stale, smelling faintly of cedarwood, old cardboard, and dust. It was significantly warmer down here than out in the car, insulated by the thick concrete walls and the earth surrounding it. I pulled out my phone and turned the screen brightness down to its absolute lowest setting, using the faint bluish glow to navigate. I did not dare turn on the actual flashlight app, terrified that a bright beam of light might shine up through the floorboards or catch the attention of a security camera. The basement of my parents' mansion was a massive graveyard of discarded luxury. As I crept forward, the dim light from my phone illuminated towering stacks of expensive things they had bought and forgotten. There was a massive leather sectional sofa covered in a clear plastic tarp. There were countless heavy storage bins, labeled with Jessica's name, overflowing with old pageant dresses, unused ski equipment, and expensive childhood toys she had discarded. It was absolutely sickening to look at. My son was freezing in a car outside, fighting off hypothermia, while they stored a literal fortune in unused blankets and furniture, down here just collecting dust. I was not here to steal anything valuable. I just desperately needed to find a heavy blanket, a sleeping bag, or the small electric space heater I remembered my father used to keep near the utility closet. I needed just one single item to wrap around Leo so he could survive the night without ending up in a hospital. I navigated carefully through the labyrinth of boxes, moving toward the far back corner of the sprawling basement. This was the area that used to be Grandfather William's workspace. When he was alive, he spent hours down here, carving beautiful wooden figures and repairing broken clocks. He was a man who believed in the profound value of hard work, a stark and total contrast to my father, who had inherited all of his wealth and squandered the emotional legacy his father had tried to build. The sight of Grandfather William's old oak workbench brought a sudden stinging lump to my throat. His old hand tools were still hanging on the pegboard, completely untouched and gathering thick layers of dust. I remembered sitting on a wooden stool right next to him while he worked, crying about how unfairly my mother treated me compared to Jessica. He would set down his carving knife, look me right in the eye, and tell me that pressure makes diamonds, but it also turns coal to dust. He told me my parents were treating me like coal, but he knew I was a diamond. He promised me that one day I would shine so brightly it would blind them all. I swallowed the tears and forced myself to focus on the present reality. I could not afford to be sentimental right now. Leo needed me to be strong. I swept the dim light of my phone across the high storage shelves built directly above the wooden workbench. There, pushed all the way toward the back of the highest shelf, I spotted exactly what I needed. It was the corner of a thick, heavy military-grade wool blanket. It was folded tightly and wrapped in a clear plastic protective bag. It was absolutely perfect. It would be more than enough to insulate Leo in the back seat of the car and trap his body heat until the sun came up. The only problem was that the shelf was entirely too high for me to reach from the floor. I looked around the dim space and found Grandfather William's old wooden stool tucked under the bench. I pulled it out and tested it with my foot to make sure the legs were still sturdy, then carefully climbed up. My legs were trembling uncontrollably, utterly exhausted from the terror of the earthquake, the freezing cold, and the sheer adrenaline of sneaking through the house of the people who abused me. I stretched my arms upward, my fingertips just barely brushing the cold plastic wrapping of the blanket. My hands were so completely numb from the freezing temperatures outside that I had almost no grip strength left in my fingers. I pressed my weight onto my toes, reaching as high as I physically could. I managed to get a solid, desperate hold on the thick fabric and began to carefully pull it toward the edge of the shelf. But the blanket was stuck. It was wedged tightly beneath something heavy, something completely hidden in the deep shadows near the ceiling joists. I tugged harder, feeling the plastic slide forward an inch and then another 2 inches. I should have stopped right there. I should have climbed down and found a taller ladder to see what was blocking it, but I was completely blinded by desperation and the singular thought of getting back to my freezing child. I planted my feet firmly on the stool, gripped the edge of the blanket with both hands, and gave it one final forceful yank. The blanket suddenly gave way, sliding completely off the wooden shelf and tumbling into my arms. But it did not fall alone. The heavy object that had been resting directly on top of it was violently dislodged from its hidden spot. Time seemed to slow down into a terrifying crawl. I saw a dark, solid rectangular shape plummet from the high shelf. It brushed violently past my left shoulder, missing my face by mere inches. I gasped, throwing my hands up to protect my head, instantly losing my balance on the small wooden stool. The object hit the concrete floor of the basement. The sound was absolutely deafening. It was a massive, resonant crash of heavy metal slamming forcefully into solid cement. The noise echoed through the dark, cavernous space like a gunshot loud enough to rattle the wooden floorboards directly above my head. I stumbled backward off the stool landing incredibly hard on my hands and knees. My heart stopped completely dead in my chest. I stayed absolutely frozen on the cold concrete floor, entirely paralyzed by sheer terror. The sound had been incredibly loud. I squeezed my eyes shut, straining my ears to listen, fully expecting to hear the inevitable sound of my father's heavy footsteps thundering down the basement stairs. I waited for the overhead lights to blaze on, for the screaming to start, for the police to be called on me for breaking and entering. I held my breath until my lungs actively burned, but the house remained completely silent. The thick walls and heavy flooring of the mansion must have absorbed the absolute worst of the impact. Richard and Susan, deep in their luxurious, comfortable sleep on the 3rd floor of the estate, had not heard a single thing. I let out a long, shaky breath, my entire body trembling violently as the adrenaline spiked fiercely through my veins. I crawled forward on the freezing concrete, shining the dim screen of my phone toward the object that had fallen from the ceiling. It was a steel safe. It was roughly the size of a large shoebox, constructed from heavy dark metal that had faded and oxidized deeply over the years. It was heavily dented on one corner from the violent fall, resting at a tilted angle on the dusty floor. I recognized the metal box almost immediately. It belonged to Grandfather William. He used to keep it tucked away securely in the very back of his bedroom closet, guarding it with absolute, unwavering secrecy. I had always assumed my parents had thrown it away or emptied its contents immediately after he passed away 10 years ago. The impact against the solid concrete floor had been devastating to the structural integrity of the box. The old rusty brass padlock that had secured the heavy steel latch for over a decade was completely shattered. The thick metal shackle had snapped cleanly in half, laying in 2 pieces on the floor. and the heavy lid of the steel safe was now resting slightly ajar. I sat there in the freezing darkness of my parents' basement, staring blindly at the broken lock. I had sneaked down here looking for nothing but a simple wool blanket to keep my young son alive through the darkest, coldest night of our lives. I had absolutely no intention of uncovering the deeply buried secrets of the dead. But as I reached out my trembling, numb fingers to lift the heavy steel lid, I had absolutely no idea that what I was about to find inside this rusted box would completely destroy the empire of lies my parents had built and hand me the ultimate power to take back everything they had stolen from me. The cold concrete floor of the basement seeped through the thin fabric of my jeans, but I barely felt it. My entire focus was locked on the heavy steel safe, resting at an awkward angle in the dust. The rusty brass padlock had completely snapped in half from the fall. Its broken pieces lay discarded on the gray cement like a severed chain. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. The sound echoed so loudly in my own ears that I was terrified it would wake the people sleeping 3 stories above me. My hands were shaking violently as I reached out to touch the cold metal lid. I had expected Grandfather William to fill this hidden box with sentimental tokens. I thought I might find his old collection of silver coins, or perhaps the antique pocket watches he used to restore. I thought I might find old photographs of a time when this family felt somewhat normal. I gently lifted the heavy steel lid and pushed it back on its creaking hinges. I leaned forward and angled the dim bluish light of my phone screen into the dark interior of the box. There were no antique watches inside. There were no silver coins or old family photo albums. Instead, the safe was tightly packed with thick, cream-colored legal folders. The heavy cardstock was yellowing slightly, at the edges indicating they had been sitting in this damp basement for a very long time. I wiped my trembling hands on my jacket and carefully lifted the first thick folder from the top of the stack. The paper felt heavy and authoritative in my grip. The front cover bore the embossed golden seal of a prominent law firm located in downtown Los Angeles. I recognized the name immediately. It was the firm of Jonathan Hayes, the high-powered estate attorney Grandfather William used to consult when I was a little girl. I opened the folder. The first page was a thick sheet of official parchment stamped with a raised notary seal and dated exactly 10 years ago, just 3 weeks before my grandfather passed away. I brought my phone closer to the paper, squinting to read the dense black text in the terrible lighting. The bold, capitalized letters at the very top of the page seemed to leap off the paper and strike me directly in the chest. Deed of Trust. I blinked rapidly, rubbing my tired eyes, thinking the dim light was playing tricks on my exhausted brain. But the letters remained exactly the same. As a professional accountant, I handled complex financial documents on a daily basis. I knew exactly what a deed of trust was. I knew the profound legal weight it carried. I scanned down to the property description section. My breath caught in my throat and completely refused to leave my lungs. The document explicitly listed the exact legal address of the massive 5-bedroom mansion I was currently standing underneath. It detailed the square footage, the property lines, and the exact parcel number. I read the grantor section. It listed Grandfather William as the sole and absolute owner of the property. That fact alone was enough to make my head spin. For my entire life, Richard and Susan had paraded around the neighborhood, boasting about the incredible real estate investment they had made. They hosted lavish neighborhood association meetings, acting like self-made real estate moguls. They constantly lectured me about my poor financial choices, while standing in a house they proudly claimed to have bought and paid for with their own hard work. But this document proved they had never owned it. Grandfather William owned it. My eyes frantically raced down the page to the beneficiary section. The legal jargon was dense, but my accounting background allowed me to translate it perfectly. Grandfather William had not left the house to my father. He had not left it to my mother. He had established an irrevocable trust. The primary and sole beneficiary of that trust was listed clearly in bold black ink. Chloe Elizabeth Myers. My own name stared back at me. I dropped the folder onto the concrete floor as if it had suddenly caught fire. I clamped both hands over my mouth to stifle the massive, completely involuntary gasp that ripped through my throat. I sat back on my heels, my mind spinning completely out of control. This mansion did not belong to my parents. It did not belong to Richard and Susan. It belonged to me. I picked the document back up with trembling fingers, desperate to read the specific terms and conditions. The trust stipulated that Richard and Susan were granted a temporary conditional right of occupancy upon grandfather William's passing. They were legally designated as mere caretakers. They were permitted to live in the home, rent-free provided they maintained the property and paid the annual property taxes. But they possessed absolutely zero equity in the estate. They held no ownership rights whatsoever. The absolute and unencumbered transfer of the title was scheduled to trigger automatically on a very specific date. I read the clause over and over again, making sure I was not hallucinating in the freezing basement. The property and all associated equity shall be fully transferred to the sole ownership of Chloe Elizabeth Myers upon her 30th birthday. My 30th birthday. I sat in the dark doing the simple, devastating math in my head. I am 32 years old. My 30th birthday passed 2 entire years ago. For 2 full years, I have been the sole legal owner of a multi-million-dollar estate in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Southern California. My parents knew about this. They had to know. They were the temporary caretakers living in the house. When grandfather William passed away, they would have received a copy of the trust instructions from the attorney. Instead of executing the legal transfer of ownership when I turned 30, they had deliberately and maliciously hidden the truth. They took grandfather William's safe, dragged it down into the deepest, darkest corner of the basement, and buried it beneath a mountain of my sister's old discarded beauty pageant dresses. They had actively conspired to conceal a massive legal inheritance from their own daughter. I dug deeper into the safe, my hands moving with frantic purpose. Beneath the deed was a smaller white envelope with my name written across the front in grandfather William's elegant looping cursive. I carefully broke the wax seal and pulled out a single sheet of lined notebook paper. My dearest Chloe. The letter began. If you are reading this, it means my deepest fears have unfortunately come true. I am writing this to you because I know the exact kind of people your parents are. I have watched Richard and Susan treat you like a burden for your entire life. I have watched them shower your sister Jessica with endless unearned luxury while demanding absolute perfection and silent suffering from you. I felt a hot tear slide down my freezing cheek, landing on the crisp white paper. Grandfather William had seen it. He had seen everything. While I spent my childhood thinking I was crazy, thinking I was simply unlovable, he had been watching them abuse me. Your parents are profoundly selfish people, he continued. They care only for appearances and the hollow prestige of wealth. I know that when I pass away, they will attempt to take everything and leave you with absolutely nothing. They believe you are weak because you are kind. They mistake your quiet endurance for submission. But I know you have a brilliant mind and a heart of pure gold. You are the only person in this family who actually understands the true value of hard work and honest living. I placed the house into a blind trust to completely protect it from their greed. I set the transfer age to 30 because I wanted to give you time to build your own fierce independence away from their toxic influence. I wanted you to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet before you inherited this massive responsibility. The house is yours, Chloe. It is your sanctuary. It is your ultimate security. Do not ever let them convince you that you do not deserve it. I love you more than words can express. I held the letter against my chest, squeezing my eyes shut as a wave of profound, overwhelming grief washed over me. Grandfather William had spent the last months of his life quietly building an impenetrable legal fortress to protect me from my own parents. He had loved me enough to secure my future. But that grief was very quickly swallowed by something else. A dark, burning heat began to rise in the pit of my stomach. It spread through my chest and radiated out to my freezing fingertips, completely obliterating the cold of the basement. It was pure, unfiltered rage. I thought about the last 2 years of my life. I thought about the grueling 14-hour workdays, sitting at my computer until my vision blurred just to afford groceries and rent for my tiny apartment. I thought about the sheer panic I felt every single month when the heating bill arrived. I thought about wearing my shoes until the soles wore completely through, because every spare dollar had to go into a savings account for Leo. All of that suffering, all of that endless, exhausting panic had been entirely unnecessary. For 2 full years, I had been a millionaire on paper. I had owned a sprawling piece of premium real estate. I could have sold this house and bought a beautiful, comfortable home for me and my son in a safe neighborhood. I could have paid for his future college tuition in cash. I could have breathed easily for the first time in my adult life. Instead, my parents had stolen that piece from me. They had brazenly continued to live in my house, completely rent-free. They had walked across my hardwood floors, cooked in my gourmet kitchen, and slept in my master bedroom while I struggled to survive. They threw lavish parties serving expensive catered food and fine wine to their wealthy friends, projecting an image of total superiority. They looked down on my modest lifestyle, judging my cheap clothes and my old car, while literally stealing the roof over their heads directly from my hands. The sheer breathtaking audacity of it made me physically dizzy, but nothing, absolutely nothing compared to what had happened just an hour ago. I looked up at the heavy wooden floorboards above my head. Just a few rooms away, Susan was sleeping peacefully under a thick down comforter. Earlier tonight, I had stood on the front porch of this exact house. I had stood there holding my terrified, freezing 5-year-old son in my arms. We had just lost our home in a violent natural disaster. We had nowhere to go. I had begged my mother for a tiny square of carpet on the living room floor so my child would not freeze to death. And she had looked me dead in the eye and told me there was no room. She had told me that Jessica and Brad needed the massive guest bedrooms because their air conditioning was broken. She had called me dramatic. She had called me a burden. She had told me to figure it out on my own. And then she had slammed the door of my own house in my face. She locked me out of the very property I legally owned. She forced the rightful owner of the estate to sleep in a freezing 10-year-old Honda Civic in the driveway. The absolute malice required to look your shivering grandson in the eye and deny him shelter in a home you do not even own was beyond anything I could comprehend. It was not just cruel. It was evil. It was a deep, rotting sickness in their souls. I carefully folded Grandfather William's letter and placed it back into the white envelope. I gathered the heavy stack of trust documents, the official property deed, the notarized signatures, and the clear legal instructions. I unzipped my canvas backpack and slid the entire stack safely inside, nestling it securely right next to my laptop. I pulled out my phone and took several high-resolution photographs of the broken safe and the dusty shelf where they had hidden it. I documented every single detail, preserving the exact state of their deception. I was an accountant. I knew exactly how crucial an undisputed paper trail was. I was going to need every ounce of this evidence for the absolute war I was about to wage. I stood up from the freezing concrete floor. My knees cracked and my back ached, but I did not feel small anymore. I did not feel like the discarded, unloved, spare child. I felt like a massive, towering force of nature. I looked around the dark basement, surveying the massive piles of hoarding and luxury goods my parents had accumulated. This was not a monument to their success. It was a crime scene. It was a massive, ongoing fraud, and their time was officially up. I carefully picked up the heavy wool military blanket I had pulled from the shelf earlier. I shook the dust off the thick fabric and wrapped it tightly over my arm. I turned and walked toward the heavy basement door, moving with a new quiet authority. I stepped back out into the freezing night air. The wind whipped across my face, but it did not sting the way it had before. The sky was beginning to turn a faint bruised purple in the east, signaling the absolute earliest hours of the morning. I walked silently across the cobblestone driveway, passing Brad's expensive sports car and Jessica's massive luxury SUV. I looked at their vehicles with complete disgust. They were leeches feeding off a stolen foundation. I opened the back door of my Honda Civic. Leo was still asleep, curled into a tight, trembling ball under the damp fleece blanket. I gently draped the heavy, thick wool blanket over his small body, tucking it firmly around his shoulders and under his freezing feet. Almost instantly, his violent shivering began to slow. He let out a soft, warm sigh, and his tense face finally relaxed into peaceful sleep. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. I placed my backpack containing the ultimate weapon against my family safely on the passenger seat. I rested my hand on the canvas fabric, feeling the solid weight of the legal documents inside. I looked through the windshield at the towering facade of the mansion. The golden glow of the rising sun was just beginning to reflect off the massive glass windows. My parents would be waking up soon. Susan would likely head down to the gourmet kitchen to brew expensive coffee and prepare a lavish breakfast for Jessica and Brad before his investment meeting. They would sit around the large granite island, laughing and complaining about the minor inconvenience of an earthquake that happened miles away. They would look out the window at my car parked in the driveway and shake their heads in mild irritation, hoping I would drive away soon and stop lowering their property value. They had absolutely no idea that their entire world was about to collapse. They had no idea that the silent, obedient daughter they had abused for 32 years was sitting in her freezing car, holding the absolute legal power to strip them of everything they valued. I checked the digital clock on my dashboard. 5:30 in the morning. Law offices would open in exactly 3.5 hours. I leaned my head back against the cold headrest and waited for the sun to rise. I was not going to run away. I was not going to shrink myself. I was going to call Jonathan Hayes the moment his office doors unlocked. I was going to initiate the legal transfer of ownership. And then I was going to orchestrate the most devastating comprehensive eviction this wealthy neighborhood had ever witnessed. The morning sun pierced through the frosted windshield of my 10-year-old Honda Civic. I woke up with a sharp, agonizing ache in my neck and a heavy stiffness settling deep into my bones. My 5-year-old son Leo was still sound asleep, wrapped tightly in the military-grade wool blanket I had pulled from my grandfather's ruined safe the night before. I watched his small chest rise and fall in the freezing air. He was warm now. He was safe, but the sheer reality of where we were parked hit me like a physical blow. We were refugees sitting in a driveway, while the people who shared my blood slept in absolute luxury just 50 feet away. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive tapping echoed through the cold morning air. I flinched, completely startled. I turned my head toward the driver's side window. My father, Richard, stood outside, staring down at me with an expression of profound irritation. He was wearing a plush cashmere robe, holding a steaming mug of expensive coffee. He did not look worried about the freezing temperatures we had endured. He did not ask if his grandson had survived the night without freezing. He rapped his knuckles sharply against the glass a second time, gesturing wildly for me to roll down the window. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered slightly before coming to life. I pressed the button to roll the window down just a few inches, letting the biting morning air rush inside. "Chloe, you need to move this junk car right now," my father said, his voice lacking any trace of paternal warmth. "Brad is moving his Porsche out of the garage, and you are completely blocking the turnaround space. He has a very important investor breakfast to get to this morning, and he cannot be late." I sat there staring at the man who helped bring me into this world. My mind flashed to the heavy stack of legal documents currently resting inside my canvas backpack on the passenger seat. The deed of trust. The absolute proof that Richard was standing on my driveway, demanding I move my car off my own property to accommodate his unemployed son-in-law. I felt a dangerous laugh rising in the back of my throat. I swallowed it down. I was an accountant. I knew exactly how to play the long game. I knew that showing my cards prematurely would only give them time to prepare a defensive strategy. "I will move it," I said quietly, my voice perfectly flat. "Well, hurry up," he snapped, turning around to walk back toward the grand entrance of the mansion. "Jessica is incredibly stressed about the earthquake damage to their house, and we do not need you loitering out here, making the neighborhood look like a homeless encampment." I rolled the window up. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the long cobblestone driveway. I did not look back at the sprawling stone estate. I did not need to. I owned it. I drove slowly through the wealthy gated community, navigating the quiet streets as the neighborhood began to wake up. Landscapers were already arriving to trim perfectly green lawns. Luxury cars were pulling out of massive driveways. It was a world entirely insulated from the destruction and chaos my son and I had faced just a few miles away. I needed to find a safe, warm place for Leo before the law offices opened. I drove to a small 24-hour diner on the edge of the city. We walked inside, and the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee brought a rush of tears to my eyes. I counted the meager funds left in my checking account. I had exactly $34. I ordered a stack of pancakes for Leo and a cup of black coffee for myself. While Leo ate happily, completely oblivious to the massive storm brewing in our lives, I pulled out my phone and searched for the law firm listed on the deed, Jonathan Hayes and Associates. They were located in a prestigious high-rise building in downtown Los Angeles. They opened at 9 o'clock. I waited in that diner booth, watching the clock tick forward, every minute feeling like an entire lifetime. At exactly 8:45, I paid the bill and drove downtown. The parking structure attached to the legal high-rise was expensive, but I pulled a $20 bill from my emergency cash reserve. This was an investment. I held Leo's small hand as we walked into the towering glass lobby and rode the polished steel elevator up to the 40th floor. The law office of Jonathan Hayes was exactly what you would expect from a firm that managed the estates of the ultra-wealthy. The reception area featured imported marble floors, rich mahogany paneled walls, and a stunning panoramic view of the Los Angeles skyline. The receptionist, a polished woman in a tailored suit, looked up at my rumpled jacket and my exhausted face with a practiced mask of professional courtesy. "Can I help you?" she asked politely. "I need to see Jonathan Hayes," I said, keeping my voice steady. "My name is Chloe Myers. I am William Myers' granddaughter. It is a matter concerning an irrevocable trust." The receptionist typed my name into her computer. Her polite smile instantly shifted into an expression of genuine surprise. "Please take a seat, Ms. Myers. I will let Mr. Hayes know you are here immediately." I barely had time to sit down on the plush leather waiting room sofa before a set of heavy wooden doors swung open. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes walked into the lobby. He looked exactly like the kind of man who did not tolerate fools. He walked directly toward me, extending his hand. "Chloe," he said, his voice warm and resonant. "You have absolutely no idea how long I have waited for you to walk through those doors." He ushered Leo and me into his massive corner office. He had his assistant bring Leo a plate of fresh cookies and a coloring book, setting him up comfortably at a small side table before turning his full attention to me. I opened my canvas backpack and carefully pulled out the thick, yellowing folder I had rescued from the broken steel safe. I placed it on the polished mahogany desk between us. "I found this last night," I said, my voice trembling just slightly. "My grandfather hid it in the basement. My parents never told me about it. They kicked me out of the house last night during the earthquake because my sister and her husband needed the guest rooms. They made my son and me sleep in a freezing car. But I found this. And I need to know if it is real." Jonathan Hayes did not look shocked. He looked deeply, profoundly sad. He picked up the document and adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the raised notary seals and the signatures. "It is entirely real, Chloe," he said, leaning forward and folding his hands on the desk. "Your grandfather William sat in this exact office 15 years ago. He was a brilliant man, but he carried a tremendous amount of sorrow. He knew that Richard and Susan were fundamentally broken people. He knew they worshipped status and money while completely neglecting you. He wanted to ensure that when he passed away, you would be entirely protected from their greed." He tapped the document with his pen. "This deed of trust is absolute. It legally bypassed the standard probate process. The house belongs to you. It has belonged to you since the exact day you turned 30. Richard and Susan were legally obligated to notify my firm and formally execute the title transfer 2 years ago. They were strictly designated as temporary tenants." I let out a long, shaky breath. The validation washed over me like a warm wave. I was not crazy. I was not worthless. I was a millionaire property owner, and my parents were nothing but glorified squatters. They hid the safe, I told him. They buried it under piles of junk in the basement. They have been living there, parading around the neighborhood, hosting massive parties, and pretending they own the estate. They look down on me because I struggle to pay my rent, while they are literally stealing my inheritance. Jonathan sighed heavily. It is classic narcissistic entitlement. They convince themselves they deserve the house more than you did. But their delusion does not change the law. We can initiate the eviction process today. We will file a formal notice to vacate and force them to leave the property within 30 days. You will have your home back, Chloe. For a brief, beautiful moment, I felt a soaring sense of triumph. I pictured the look on my mother's face when a sheriff handed her an eviction notice. I pictured Brad having to move his precious Porsche out of my garage permanently. The justice felt incredibly sweet. But as I would quickly learn, the nightmare was far from over. Jonathan turned to his computer monitor. Let me just pull up the current property tax records and the county title registry to ensure there are no outstanding liens or unpaid tax balances on the estate before we file the eviction. Richard was legally obligated to pay the property taxes in exchange for his rent-free occupancy, but we should verify everything is clear. I nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief. As an accountant, I appreciated his thoroughness. I watched him type quickly on his keyboard, navigating the complex legal databases of the county recorder. Suddenly, Jonathan's fingers stopped moving. The comfortable silence in the office shattered. I watched as the color rapidly drained from the lawyer's face. His sharp, intelligent eyes widened in absolute shock as he stared at the glowing screen. He leaned closer, completely still, reading something that made his jaw tighten with visible anger. "Chloe," he asked, his voice dropping to a serious, urgent tone. "Did you recently authorize a home equity line of credit against this property?" I stared at him, completely confused. "What?" "No, of course not. I did not even know I owned the house until 4 o'clock this morning. How could I possibly authorize a loan?" Jonathan turned the monitor so I could see the screen. He pointed a steady finger at a digital document filed with the county just 6 months ago. Because according to this record, a major national bank issued a $300,000 home equity loan against the value of your estate. He explained, his voice thick with disbelief. The loan was approved and the funds were completely drawn down and transferred to an external business account. My accounting brain immediately went into overdrive trying to process the magnitude of what he was saying. $300,000. A HELOC is a revolving line of credit secured directly by the equity in a home. If the monthly payments are not met, the bank possesses the absolute legal right to foreclose on the property. That was a massive, staggering amount of debt attached directly to my house. But I did not sign anything, I insisted, panic rising rapidly in my chest. I have never walked into a bank to borrow against that house. I do not even have an account with that institution. Jonathan clicked on another tab, pulling up the scanned digital copies of the original loan application. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted bank forms. There, at the very bottom of the final page, was a signature. It read, Chloe Elizabeth Myers. It was a masterful, incredibly accurate forgery of my handwriting, but it was not mine. They forged my signature. I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical punch to the stomach. My own parents forged my signature to take out a massive loan on a house they do not even own. Jonathan clicked to the next page showing the wire transfer authorization. We need to see exactly where this money went. If they transferred it to their personal accounts, we have a clear-cut case of criminal wire fraud and identity theft. He scrolled down to the receiving account details. I read the name of the business entity that had received the stolen $300,000. The bold black letters on the screen made my blood run completely cold. The funds were wired directly to an account registered to Golden Horizon Realty, LLC. I knew exactly what that was. I knew exactly who owned it. Golden Horizon Realty was not a real functioning business. It was a completely fictitious vanity project created by my sister Jessica and her husband Brad. For the last 6 months, they had been bragging to everyone in our extended family and their wealthy church congregation that they were starting a high-end luxury real estate investment firm. Brad had bought a brand new Porsche to project an image of success. Jessica had completely restyled her wardrobe with designer clothes. They hosted expensive dinners and claimed they had secured a massive round of initial funding from a silent angel investor. They did not have an angel investor. They had me. My parents had committed multiple federal crimes, forging my identity and fraudulently mortgaging my stolen inheritance just so Jessica and Brad could play pretend as wealthy entrepreneurs. They had literally stolen $300,000 of my equity to fund a fake company. The sheer monumental scale of their betrayal was almost impossible to comprehend. It was one thing to withhold a deed and live in a house for free. That was greedy, but to actively steal my identity, commit massive bank fraud, and saddle a struggling single mother with $300,000 of high-interest debt just to buy a Porsche for their golden child. That was purely evil. If the bank discovers the underlying deed of trust and realizes the loan was issued fraudulently, they will immediately call the loan due in full. Jonathan explained his expression completely grim, and because your name is forged on the documents, they will come after you for the $300,000 if you cannot pay it. They will foreclose on the house and seize the property to recover their losses. Your parents have effectively placed a ticking time bomb directly under your financial future. I looked over at Leo. He was happily coloring a picture of a rocket ship, completely oblivious to the fact that his grandparents had just handed us a death sentence. I felt the air leave the room. The temporary triumph I had felt just moments ago evaporated completely entirely, replaced by a terrifying, suffocating reality. My parents had not just stolen my past, they had stolen my future. They had tied a massive concrete block of fraudulent debt around my neck and pushed me into the ocean. They assumed I was too poor, too tired, and too ignorant to ever figure out what they had done. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound fear and explosive burning rage. "How do we stop them?" Jonathan closed the file on his computer and folded his hands on the desk. He looked at me with the absolute fierce determination of a man preparing for a brutal, unyielding war. "We are going to let them think they got away with it," he said quietly. "We are going to gather every single piece of financial evidence, every wire transfer, and every forged document. And then, Chloe, we are going to tear their fraudulent empire completely to the ground." Jonathan Hayes immediately tapped into an emergency contingency fund built into grandfather William's trust. It was designed specifically for situations where the primary beneficiary faced sudden catastrophic hardship. Within an hour, I had a cashier's check in my hand. It was enough to secure a clean, safe, fully furnished short-term rental in a quiet neighborhood far away from the earthquake zone and far away from my toxic parents. I drove Leo to a brightly lit grocery store, letting him pick out his favorite cereal and fresh fruit. For the first time in 32 years, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of financial terror begin to lift off my shoulders. We settled into the rental that evening. I tucked Leo into a warm, comfortable bed with clean sheets. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop drinking hot tea and reviewing the aggressive legal strategy Jonathan and I had discussed. We were going to file a formal freeze on the property title the very next morning to stop my family from draining another single dime of my equity. At 9 o'clock the following morning, Jonathan executed a hard legal lock on the deed of the mansion. This action immediately alerted the county clerk and sent an automated legal notification directly to the major bank that held the fraudulent $300,000 home equity line of credit. The bank, realizing the title was under severe dispute, instantly froze the remaining funds in Jessica and Brad's fake business account. By noon, my father would have received a frantic phone call from Brad screaming that his corporate debit cards were suddenly declining. My parents would have called the bank, and the bank would have informed them that the absolute legal owner of the property, Chloe Elizabeth Myers, had placed a hard freeze on the asset. That was how they finally found out. They did not call me to apologize. They did not call to explain their massive financial crimes. Instead of panicking over the fact that they were facing decades in federal prison for bank fraud and identity theft, Richard and Susan did what deeply broken narcissists always do. They went on the absolute offensive. The retaliation came with terrifying speed. It was barely 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Leo was sitting on the living room rug of our bright rental, happily building a massive tower out of colorful plastic blocks. I was in the kitchen preparing sandwiches for lunch. The afternoon was incredibly peaceful. Then a sharp, heavy, authoritative knock echoed through the front door. It was not the casual knock of a delivery driver or a friendly neighbor. It was a firm, heavy knock that demanded immediate compliance. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and walked to the door, looking through the peephole. A woman with a stern, serious expression stood on the porch holding a thick leather binder. Standing directly behind her was a uniformed city police officer with his hands resting casually on his utility belt. My heart dropped completely into my stomach, plummeting into an abyss of sudden cold dread. I opened the door slowly, my hands trembling wildly against the wood. The woman held up a laminated identification badge. She introduced herself as a senior investigator for Child Protective Services. She stated that they had received an urgent, highly credible report regarding the immediate safety and physical welfare of my 5-year-old son. The police officer asked heavily if they could step inside the premises. I was completely paralyzed by a cold, suffocating terror. Every single horror story I had ever heard about children being ripped from their mother's arms and thrown into the dark, terrifying foster care system flashed through my mind in a matter of awful seconds. I stepped aside and let them into the living room. Leo looked up from his blocks, his wide, innocent eyes taking in the tall police officer. I immediately moved to stand directly between my son and the authorities, my maternal instincts flaring into a fierce, absolute panic. The social worker sat down on the sofa and opened her heavy binder. Her eyes scanned the clean, warm apartment, clearly confused by the pleasant environment. She looked at me and explained the severe nature of the allegations they had received just an hour earlier. She read directly from her official intake report. The caller claimed that I was an unstable, erratic, unemployed drifter. The caller stated that I was completely homeless and currently forcing my young child to live out of a filthy, freezing 10-year-old car. The report detailed how I had recklessly exposed my son to dangerous 40-degree temperatures the previous night, intentionally denying him proper shelter, and that I was completely incapable of providing him with basic food or necessary medical care. The caller insisted that Leo was in imminent life-threatening danger and needed to be removed from my custody immediately before I disappeared with him into the streets. I felt all the blood rush out of my face. The room started to spin in a sickening, dizzying circle. They had used the exact events of the previous night against me. They had taken the horrific trauma of the earthquake and the awful fact that they had mercilessly locked us out in the freezing cold, and they had violently twisted it to make me look like an abusive, negligent monster. Susan and Richard had deliberately weaponized my darkest moment of suffering. They were actively trying to steal my child. They were absolutely willing to throw their own flesh and blood into the deeply broken state foster care system, willing to traumatize a 5-year-old boy simply to maintain control over a house they did not own and a fraudulent loan they could not pay back. The sheer bottomless depravity of their actions was almost impossible for my brain to process. I forced myself to breathe, taking deep, slow intakes of air. I remembered Jonathan's calm, steady voice telling me to always rely on the paper trail. I sat down across from the social worker and began to dismantle their vicious lies with cold, absolute precision. I pulled up my banking application and showed her the substantial emergency funds Jonathan had secured from my trust, proving I had deep, immediate financial resources. I showed her the signed lease agreement for the fully furnished, safe rental property we were sitting in. I brought out my laptop and opened my accounting portal, proving I was not an unemployed drifter, but a successful freelance accountant with a steady, verifiable income from multiple corporate clients. Finally, I showed her the official city report with the red tag attached to my previous apartment, proving that my sudden displacement was caused by a devastating natural disaster, not by erratic or neglectful behavior. Then, with a voice shaking with raw, unadulterated anger, I explained exactly what happened the night before. I told the social worker how my extremely wealthy parents had locked their own freezing grandson out of a massive mansion because my sister needed 2 luxury guest rooms for her excess luggage and a comfortable temperature. I told her that the very people who called in this malicious report were the ones who had actively denied a 5-year-old child basic emergency shelter during a state of emergency. The social worker listened quietly, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. The police officer visibly relaxed his rigid posture, looking around the warm safe room and watching Leo happily playing with his toys. The heavy hostility in the room completely evaporated, replaced by a mutual unspoken understanding of the profoundly malicious nature of the false report. Just as the social worker was packing up her binder, preparing to officially close the investigation as a completely unfounded malicious claim, my cell phone vibrated violently on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a new text message. The sender was listed simply as Susan. I walked over and picked up the phone. The social worker paused at the door, noticing the sudden dark shift in my expression. She asked gently if everything was all right. I looked down at the glowing screen. The message from my mother was not an apology. It was not a question about Leo's safety or our well-being. It was a cold, calculated ransom note dripping with venom and supreme, disgusting arrogance. I stared at the harsh digital letters, my vision blurring with a mixture of profound disgust and fiery rage. The text message read exactly like this. "We know you talked to a lawyer about the house today. We also know the state is at your door right now to take Leo away because you are an unfit mother. You are not going to win this, Chloe. Sign the quitclaim deed transferring the house permanently to us, and I will withdraw the CPS report. Do this quietly, and I will give you $5,000 to start over somewhere else. Do not test me. I will make sure you never see your son again." $5,000. She was offering me $5,000 of my own stolen equity in exchange for a multi-million-dollar estate. She was offering me a pathetic, insulting bribe to walk away from my rightful inheritance while simultaneously threatening to destroy my entire life and rip my child from my arms if I refused to submit to her tyranny. She truly believed I was still that terrified, broken 15-year-old girl who would simply bow her head and obey her every command. She thought the overwhelming threat of losing my child would paralyze me into absolute submission. She thought her incredibly dirty tricks would force me to surrender the foundation of my entire future just to keep my son safe from the foster system. I did not delete the message. I did not throw my phone across the room in a fit of rage. I turned around and walked directly back to the social worker who was watching me with deep professional concern. I held my phone out, turning the screen so she and the police officer could read the exact horrifying words my mother had just sent. I watched their eyes scan the text message carefully. I watched the professional detachment on the social worker's face melt into absolute, undeniable disgust. The police officer let out a low, harsh breath, shaking his head slowly at the sheer, unbelievable audacity of the blackmail. They now had absolute, undeniable written proof that the child abuse report was a fraudulent, weaponized attack designed entirely to extort a massive real estate asset from a disaster victim. The social worker looked me dead in the eye and told me to take a screenshot of the message immediately and back it up to a secure cloud drive. She assured me that not only was my case permanently and completely closed, but she would be filing a formal severe notation in the state system regarding the malicious nature of my parents' false report. Calling in a fake child abuse claim to extort a family member was a severe criminal offense. She promised me that Leo was perfectly safe and that my parents would never, ever be able to use the state child welfare agency against me ever again. After they finally left the apartment, fell into a deep, heavy silence. I locked the front door securely and walked over to my son. I pulled him into a fierce, desperate hug, burying my face in his soft, warm hair. He giggled happily and wrapped his little arms around my neck, completely unaware of the massive, invisible war that was currently raging all around him. I held him until my breathing completely steadied. The tears of initial panic completely dried up, replaced by a cold, highly calculating focus. My parents had crossed a dark, terrible line that could never, ever be uncrossed. They had brought my innocent child into their sick, twisted game of incredible greed. They had threatened the most sacred, important thing in my entire world. Any lingering shred of familial obligation I might have subconsciously harbored completely evaporated in that exact defining moment. They were not my parents anymore. They were enemies. They were financial terrorists who had forged my signature, stolen my identity, and tried to legally kidnap my child through disgusting bureaucratic manipulation. I picked up my phone and dialed Jonathan Hayes. He answered on the very first ring. I read Susan's text message aloud to him, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I told him about the pathetic $5,000 bribe. I told him about the explicit threat to take Leo away forever if I did not sign a quitclaim deed. Jonathan listened quietly, and when I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy with intense professional outrage. He told me that this text message was the absolute final nail in their legal coffin. It was perfectly documented proof of extortion, tying their fraudulent CPS report directly to their desperate criminal need to secure the deed of trust they had been hiding for years. Jonathan asked me exactly how I wanted to proceed. The original plan had simply been to file the standard eviction and let the major bank deal with the massive loan fraud. But my parents had willfully decided to escalate this to a level of psychological warfare. They wanted to play extremely dirty. They wanted to destroy me completely. So I decided it was time to let them dig their own massive graves. I told Jonathan my plan. I was not going to fight them over the phone. I was not going to argue with Susan through long text messages. I was going to use their supreme, blinding arrogance completely against them. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, right up until the exact moment it destroyed them forever. I opened a new message window and typed a reply to my mother. I crafted the message incredibly carefully, channeling the exact voice of the terrified, defeated daughter she expected me to be. I made myself sound completely broken and desperate. I wrote that I was absolutely terrified of losing Leo. I wrote that I could not fight her vast resources and that I just wanted the entire nightmare to stop. I told her I would accept her $5,000 and that I was completely willing to sign the quitclaim deed to transfer the house permanently into their names to make the CPS threat go away. I pressed send and watched the little blue bubble pop up on the screen. Less than a minute later, 3 gray dots appeared on the screen, indicating she was eagerly typing a response. She was so incredibly desperate to secure her stolen wealth that she did not even pause to question how easily I had surrendered to her demands. Her reply came through dripping with sickening, condescending victory. She told me I was finally making a smart, practical choice for once in my entire life. She instructed me to come to the mansion tomorrow night. She said they were hosting a massive, lavish open house party for Brad's new wealthy real estate investors, and I could slip in quietly through the back kitchen door, sign the legal papers in her private office, take my meager check and leave before I embarrassed them in front of their important guests. I read her highly arrogant response and felt a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. They were throwing a massive, expensive party in my own house to celebrate a fake business built entirely on my stolen credit. They wanted me to sneak in like an unwanted peasant to sign away my multi-million-dollar birthright while they drank fine champagne with their rich friends. It was the absolute perfect setting for a total reckoning. I texted back a single word of confirmation. Then I called Jonathan back immediately. I told him to draft every single piece of legal destruction we possessed. I wanted the formal eviction notice. I wanted the bank fraud documentation. I wanted the police report regarding the stolen identity and the forged $300,000 loan. We were going to walk into that lavish open house party, and we were not going to sneak through any back doors. We were going to walk straight through the grand front entrance into the absolute center of their glittering fake world, and we were going to tear the entire facade down to the very foundation. The morning sunlight flooded through the large glass windows of the short-term rental house, illuminating the pristine hardwood floors and the thick, warm rugs. It was a beautiful, safe space that Jonathan Hayes had secured for us, using an emergency contingency fund built directly into my grandfather's trust. But despite the warmth of the room, my stomach was tied in agonizing, tightly coiled knots. The reality of what my parents had attempted to do had settled into my bones like heavy lead. They had not just locked us out in the cold. They had maliciously weaponized the state child welfare system against me. I paced the length of the living room, my bare feet silent on the floorboards. Leo was happily seated at the kitchen island, eating a bowl of brightly colored cereal. He was completely shielded from the horrifying nightmare his grandparents had orchestrated. I watched his small feet swinging back and forth, and a fresh, immense wave of protective fury washed over me. I had spent my entire life shielding myself from Richard and Susan's emotional abuse, But the exact moment they aimed their destructive weapons at my 5-year-old son, they fundamentally altered the rules of engagement. I was no longer a discarded daughter begging for scraps of affection. I was a mother defending her child against an active threat, and I was going to be absolutely ruthless. At precisely 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I smoothed my professional navy blouse, took a deep stabilizing breath, and walked to the front door. I opened it to find a severe-looking social worker accompanied by a state family advocate. They stepped into the bright foyer, their eyes immediately scanning the environment with practiced professional scrutiny. They were looking for signs of neglect for the homeless, erratic drifter my mother had violently painted me to be. I did not offer them defensive excuses. I did not break down into emotional pleas. I was a professional financial controller, and I handled this intrusion exactly like a hostile corporate audit. I guided them directly to the large dining table, where I had meticulously arranged a series of precisely labeled manila folders. Jonathan Hayes had prepared me perfectly for this exact moment. I did not just tell the authorities I was stable. I provided an overwhelming, insurmountable mountain of irrefutable legal and financial evidence. I opened the first folder and presented the certified lease agreement for the fully furnished 3-bedroom rental house we were sitting in. I showed them the receipt proving the rent was prepaid in full for the next 6 months. I watched the social worker's eyes widen slightly as she reviewed the paid invoice. I opened the second folder and produced certified bank statements. I showed them the emergency trust funds I had immediate access to, along with the consistent monthly income deposits from my freelance accounting practice. I provided them with a comprehensive list of my corporate clients and my professional state business license. I then showed them the official disaster relief documentation from the city. I presented the report proving that my previous apartment had been officially red tagged by structural engineers due to severe earthquake damage. This completely validated my emergency displacement and destroyed my mother's narrative that I had recklessly chosen to sleep in a car. Finally, I provided a formal legal letter directly from the law offices of Jonathan Hayes, explicitly outlining the fraudulent and retaliatory nature of the initial child abuse report. The social worker reviewed every single page in absolute silence. Meanwhile, Leo wandered into the living room carrying his favorite toy dinosaur, offering a bright, happy smile to the state advocate. The advocate smiled back, instantly charmed by my healthy, well-adjusted little boy. The heavy, tense atmosphere in the room completely dissolved. The social worker closed the final folder and looked up at me. Her professional detachment was entirely replaced by an expression of deep, sympathetic understanding. She apologized sincerely for the intrusion. She explicitly stated that it was abundantly clear this report had been filed maliciously as a cruel tool for financial leverage. She promised me that the file would be stamped as a verified false report and permanently closed by the end of the business day. She assured me that Richard and Susan would never be able to utilize the state child welfare system against me ever again. When the heavy wooden door finally clicked shut behind them, I leaned my forehead against the cool painted wood and let out a long, trembling exhale. My legs suddenly felt incredibly weak. The terrifying threat of losing my son, the absolute darkest nightmare a mother could ever face, had been fully neutralized. We were safe. The protective legal shield Jonathan and I had built was entirely impenetrable. I walked back into the living room and sat down on the plush sofa, pulling Leo into my lap. He wrapped his small arms around my neck, burying his face in my shoulder. I held him so tightly, breathing in the sweet, clean scent of his shampoo. In that quiet, safe moment, the last remaining ounce of fear completely left my body. It evaporated into the warm air of the rental house, and in its place, a cold, dark, and incredibly sharp sense of purpose finally crystallized. My parents had tried to destroy me. They had tried to steal my child to cover up their massive financial crimes and secure a house they did not own. They wanted a war. I was going to give them an absolute massacre. I put Leo down for his afternoon nap, pulling a thick, soft blanket up to his chin. Once I was certain he was sound asleep, I walked back to the kitchen island and picked up my cell phone. I opened the message thread with my mother. Her vile extortion message from yesterday was still the last text on the screen. Sign the quitclaim deed transferring the house permanently to us, and I will withdraw the CPS report. Do this quietly, and I will give you $5,000 to start over somewhere else. Do not test me. I will make sure you never see your son again. I stared at those arrogant, cruel words. Susan believed she held all the cards. She believed she was a master manipulator, pulling the strings of a terrified, helpless victim. Jonathan had advised me to simply let the formal eviction process play out legally through the courts, but I knew my parents better than anyone. If we served them with cold legal papers by mail, they would instantly panic. They would hide assets, they would hire expensive defense attorneys, and they would drag the legal process out through months of agonizing, stressful appeals. I did not want a drawn-out, invisible legal battle. I wanted a swift, decisive, and entirely public execution of their fake, wealthy empire. To do that, I needed them to feel completely victorious, right up until the very second the trap snapped shut. I sat down at the granite counter and began to type. I had to channel the exact version of myself that they expected. I had to become the frightened, desperate people-pleaser they had abused for 32 years. It was a sickening, degrading role to play, but I knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. I deliberately misspelled a few words to make it look like my hands were shaking violently as I typed. I avoided proper grammar to simulate a frantic, breathless panic. I typed the message, read it over twice, and then pressed send. Mom, please, I am so sorry. The state workers were just here. They asked me so many questions, and I was so scared they were going to take Leo away. Please do not let them take my baby. I cannot fight you and Dad anymore. I am just so tired, and I have absolutely nothing left. I will do whatever you want. I will sign the quitclaim deed and give you the house. Just please call them off and give me the $5,000 so Leo and I can leave and find a cheap place to rent. Tell me where you want me to bring the papers. I hit send and set the phone face down on the cool granite counter. My heart pounded a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I felt like a sniper holding my breath perfectly still, waiting for the target to step directly into the crosshairs. The wait was agonizing, but incredibly brief. Exactly 4 minutes later, my phone vibrated loudly against the stone counter. I flipped it over. Susan had replied. Her response was an absolute masterpiece of condescending, narcissistic victory. I read the words and felt a cold, terrifying smile stretch across my face. I am glad you are finally acting like a rational adult. Chloe, she wrote, this is the smartest choice you have ever made. Your father and I have already instructed our lawyer to draw up the formal quitclaim documents. We are hosting a very important open house party this Friday night. Brad has invited several major investors from the church congregation to view the property and discuss funding for their real estate firm. You will come to the house at exactly 8 o'clock on Friday night. You will park on the street, not in the driveway. You will come through the back kitchen entrance so you do not disturb the guests or make a scene in your condition. You will sign the papers in my private study, and then I will hand you a cashier's check for $5,000. If you do this quietly, I will make sure the state drops the investigation against you. Do not be late. I read the message a second time, committing every single ounce of its supreme arrogance to memory. They were hosting an open house party. They were actively using my stolen property to parade their fake wealth in front of religious leaders and high net worth investors to illegally fund Jessica and Brad's fictitious company. And they wanted me, the true legal owner of the multi-million-dollar estate, to slink through the servants' entrance like a beggar to sign away my birthright while they clinked champagne glasses in the parlor. It was a level of absolute cinematic villainy that I could barely wrap my mind around. But it was exactly what I needed. They had literally built the perfect stage for their own total destruction. They had gathered the exact audience they desperately wanted to impress. They had invited the very people they were actively trying to defraud. I replied with a single short submissive text. I understand, Mom. I will be there at 8. I will bring my identification. Thank you for the money. I turned off the phone screen and stood up from the counter. I walked over to the large glass window and looked out at the bright, clear California afternoon. The scared little girl who had shivered in a damp blanket in the dark just 2 nights ago was completely gone forever. In her place stood a wealthy, fiercely protective mother with absolute legal authority and an ironclad plan for vengeance. I picked up my phone and dialed Jonathan Hayes. When he answered, I did not sound frantic or scared. My voice was pure sharp steel. "Jonathan," I said, "the trap is completely set. We are going in on Friday night, and we are going to burn their entire fake world straight to the ground." Friday night arrived with a heavy blanket of fog rolling in from the coast. I stood in front of the mirror in my rental house, smoothing the fabric of my tailored navy blue suit. It was the same suit I wore to high-stakes corporate audits. I tied my hair back into a tight, professional bun. I did not look like the terrified, homeless mother Susan expected to see sneaking through her back door. I looked like a woman preparing to dismantle an empire. My phone buzzed on the dresser. It was Jonathan Hayes. He spoke with the calm, measured tone of a legal sniper taking his position. He confirmed that all the necessary documents were printed, signed, and ready for deployment. We had the official eviction notice. We had the certified deed of trust proving my absolute ownership of the estate. And most importantly, we had the complete file of bank fraud records documenting the exact path of the stolen $300,000. Jonathan told me he would be parked just outside the neighborhood gates, waiting for my text message to bring the local authorities directly to the front door. I kissed Leo goodnight, leaving him in the care of my trusted friend Elena, who had eagerly volunteered to watch him. I drove my 10-year-old Honda Civic toward my parents' wealthy neighborhood. The drive felt entirely different tonight. I was no longer a desperate victim begging for scraps of shelter. I was the landlord coming to collect a massive outstanding debt. When I reached the grand iron gates of their exclusive community, I saw the true scale of the spectacle my parents had orchestrated. The street was lined with luxury vehicles. Gleaming black luxury sedans and imported sports cars were parked bumper to bumper. My parents had hired a professional valet service to manage the overflow. As I pulled my dented, dusty car up to the front of the mansion, a young valet in a crisp white shirt rushed forward, opening my door with a slightly confused expression. "Are you here for the Myers party?" he asked, glancing nervously at my car. "I am," I replied, handing him the keys. "Keep it close. I will not be staying long." I walked up the sweeping cobblestone driveway, taking in the sheer audacity of the event. The mansion was ablaze with light. Every single window glowed against the dark night sky. I could hear the elegant sweeping notes of a live string quartet drifting out from the backyard patio. Caterers in black uniforms moved swiftly past the massive glass doors, carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. My parents were not just hosting a simple family gathering. They had meticulously engineered a high society gala. They had invited the wealthiest members of their church congregation, the local country club elite, and multiple private investors. This was a highly calculated performance. Susan knew exactly what she was doing. She deliberately chose the most public, glamorous setting possible to force my surrender. Narcissists always use an audience as a weapon. She firmly believed that my lifelong conditioning to never cause a scene would force me to quietly accept my humiliation. She assumed I would be so utterly intimidated by the wealth and status in the room that I would obediently scurry into her private study sign, away my multi-million-dollar birthright, and vanish into the night with my pathetic $5,000 bribe. She thought the party was her ultimate shield. She had absolutely no idea it was actually her public execution. I bypassed the side kitchen entrance, entirely ignoring the explicit instructions from her text message. I walked straight up the main stone steps and pushed open the massive double oak doors. The grand foyer was packed with people laughing and clinking expensive crystal champagne flutes. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and roasted meats. I stood just inside the doorway, completely unnoticed for a few minutes, simply observing the spectacular theater of their lies. To my right, my father Richard was holding court with 3 elderly men from his church council. He wore a brand new tailored tuxedo, looking completely at ease in a house he had zero legal right to occupy. He was loudly boasting about the incredible real estate market and how their family was perfectly positioned to dominate the upcoming fiscal quarter. Across the room, I spotted my sister Jessica. She was wearing a stunning emerald green designer gown that likely cost more than my entire month's rent. She was showing off a massive diamond tennis bracelet to a group of wealthy country club wives, laughing about how exhausting it was to manage so many properties. But the absolute centerpiece of the fraud was Brad. My unemployed, completely unqualified brother-in-law was standing proudly in front of the massive stone fireplace in the central living room. He was surrounded by a tight circle of serious-looking men in expensive business suits. These were the high-net-worth investors he was desperately trying to court. I moved closer to the edge of the room, blending into the crowd to listen to his pitch. Golden Horizon Realty is not just a business. Brad projected his voice, oozing with unearned confidence. It is a family legacy. My wife and I have already secured $300,000 in initial seed funding. We drew that capital from the massive equity in this very estate. That kind of financial foundation proves our absolute stability. We are looking for visionary partners to match that initial investment so we can aggressively expand our commercial acquisitions. I felt a sharp, cold knot of disgust twist in my stomach. He was literally bragging about his own massive bank fraud to solicit more money. He was using the $300,000 he had stolen by forging my signature to convince innocent church members and honest investors to hand him their hard-earned savings. The entire company was a hollow house of cards built directly on top of my stolen identity. I continued walking through the crowded room, my eyes scanning the faces until I finally found the architect of my misery. Susan was standing near the grand staircase holding a silver tray of champagne. She was talking to the senior pastor of their church, projecting the absolute picture of a pious, generous matriarch. I stepped into her direct line of sight. The exact moment her eyes locked onto mine, the pleasant, artificial smile completely vanished from her face. Her entire body went incredibly rigid. For a split second, I saw pure, absolute panic flash in her eyes. She had explicitly ordered me to use the servants' entrance. She had ordered me to remain completely out of sight. My mere presence in the main hall, dressed in a powerful corporate suit, directly challenged her total control of the narrative. She quickly excused herself from the pastor and marched directly toward me. As she closed the distance, her face contorted into a mask of furious, contained rage. She grabbed me roughly by the elbow, her manicured nails digging sharply into the fabric of my suit jacket. "What is wrong with you?" she hissed, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper so the surrounding guests would not hear. "I told you to use the back door. You look ridiculous standing out here. Do you want to ruin this night for your sister?" I looked down at her hand, gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I did not flinch. I simply stared at her with a cold, dead calm that made her grip falter. "I decided the front door suited me better," I replied, my voice perfectly level. Susan glared at me, her eyes darting nervously around the room to ensure no one was watching our tense interaction. She forcefully tried to steer me toward the dark hallway that led to her private study. "We are not doing this out here," she demanded, pulling on my arm. "Get into the office right now. The quitclaim deed is sitting on the desk. You are going to sign the papers, you are going to take your $5,000 check, and you are going to leave through the kitchen before you embarrass this family any further. Brad is right in the middle of a major pitch, and I will not have you wandering around looking like a homeless beggar, trying to ruin his investment deals." She tugged my arm again, fully expecting me to obediently follow her into the shadows. She expected me to shrink into the submissive, scared child who had slept in a freezing car just a few days ago. I planted my feet firmly onto the imported marble floor. I became an absolute, immovable object. "I am not going into the back room, Susan," I said, my voice slightly louder now, carrying just enough volume to turn the heads of a few nearby guests. Her face flushed an angry mottled red. She leaned in so close I could smell the expensive wine on her breath. "Stop causing drama, Chloe. I swear to God, if you do not walk into that office and sign that deed right now, I will call the state investigators back. I will tell them you showed up here completely unhinged. I will make sure Leo is taken from you tonight. Do not test me." She was playing her final desperate card, using the ultimate threat of ripping my child away to force my compliance. But she did not know that her weapon had already been completely neutralized. She did not know that the state investigator had already flagged her as a malicious extortionist. I smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly calm smile that made Susan actually take a physical step backward. "You cannot call anyone Susan," I said softly. I reached my hand into my leather tote bag. My fingers brushed against the heavy, thick manila folder containing the true deed of trust, the eviction notice, and the massive stack of explosive bank fraud evidence. The paper trail that would end her entire world was currently resting securely in my grip. I pulled my phone out with my other hand and quickly sent a single predetermined text message to Jonathan Hayes, who was waiting just down the street. "It is time." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned my full attention back to the woman who had abused me for my entire existence. I did not lower my voice anymore. I did not try to hide the confrontation. I let the full, clear resonance of my voice carry across the marble foyer, directly cutting through the soft, elegant music of the string quartet. "If you want me to sign a legal document regarding the ownership of this estate," I said clearly, my words echoing off the high ceilings, "you are going to have to bring it out here. We are going to do this right here in the center of the room." Susan's eyes widened in sheer, absolute horror. Several guests standing nearby completely stopped their conversations, turning to stare at the escalating scene. Richard, noticing the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere, quickly excused himself from the church elders and began marching angrily toward us. Brad paused his investment pitch by the fireplace, his brow furrowing in confusion as he noticed the tension radiating from the foyer. "You are insane," Susan hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained panic. "I will not let you cause a scene in my house." But I was already walking. I stepped away from the dark hallway and moved directly into the absolute center of the grand living room, placing myself right between the massive stone fireplace and the long catered dining table. I anchored myself in the brightest, most visible spot in the entire mansion. "Bring the paper, Susan!" I challenged, my voice ringing with total, undeniable authority. "If this house truly belongs to you, then you have absolutely nothing to hide. Bring the quitclaim deed out here and let everyone see exactly what you are forcing me to sign." The string quartet completely stopped playing. The lively hum of the luxury open house party died a sudden, jarring death. 50 wealthy guests, church leaders, and potential investors stood perfectly still, their champagne glasses suspended in midair, staring in total shocked silence as the disgraced, forgotten daughter took absolute command of the room. The trap was fully sprung, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. I stood in the exact center of the grand living room of my own house. My feet were planted firmly on the imported Italian marble floor. The lively hum of the luxury open house party had died a sudden, jarring death. 50 wealthy guests, including prominent church leaders and potential investors, stood perfectly still. Their expensive crystal champagne glasses were suspended in midair. They were staring in total shocked silence as the disgraced and forgotten daughter took absolute command of the room. I was no longer the timid, frightened girl they had expected. I was no longer the exhausted mother huddled in a freezing car. I was wearing my tailored navy blue suit, the exact one I wore to conduct high-stakes corporate audits. My spine was straight. My shoulders were pulled back. I looked at the crowd, and I did not blink. My mother, Susan, realized very quickly that her usual tactics were completely useless. I was not going to scurry into her private study like a terrified mouse. She could not forcefully drag me down the hallway without causing a physical altercation in front of the very people she was so desperate to impress. I watched her mind work. I watched her calculate her next move. Susan was a master manipulator, and when she was cornered, she always played either the victim or the savior. Tonight, she chose the savior. Susan smoothed the front of her expensive silk dress and forced a tragic, loving smile onto her face. She let out a long, dramatic sigh that was loud enough for the senior pastor standing nearby to clearly hear. She stepped away from the dark hallway and walked directly toward me, moving right into the center of the spacious room. She reached out and placed a manicured hand on my shoulder, projecting the absolute picture of a selfless, deeply concerned mother. "Everyone please forgive this little interruption," Susan announced. Her voice was loud and clear, dripping with a sickening, artificial sweetness. I know we are all here tonight to celebrate Jessica and Brad and their wonderful new real estate venture, Golden Horizon Realty. But family must always come first. As many of you know, my youngest daughter Chloe has been going through a very difficult time. A murmur of sympathetic whispers rippled through the crowd of high society partners and church friends. I saw the senior pastor nod with a grave, understanding expression. My father Richard stepped up to stand right beside Susan, placing a supportive arm around her waist. Brad and Jessica stood near the massive stone fireplace, trying to look suitably concerned for their troubled sister. Chloe has struggled for years. Susan continued projecting her voice, so every single person in the massive room could hear her lies. She has been having terrible financial troubles and making some very poor choices. Just recently, she lost her apartment. It completely breaks our hearts to see her wandering around, unable to provide a stable home for our little grandson, Leo. We have tried to help her so many times, but she is just so lost. I stood there listening to her assassinate my character in front of 50 complete strangers. I kept my face entirely blank. I did not yell. I did not interrupt. I let her dig the hole as deep as she possibly could. I felt the collective pity of the room washing over me. These wealthy investors were looking at me like I was a broken charity case, a tragic stain on an otherwise perfect family. They had absolutely no idea that the woman speaking to them was currently committing massive bank fraud. But as a mother, I can never turn my back on my child, Susan said, pressing a fake tear from the corner of her eye. Even when she causes scenes, even when she behaves erratically, we will always be her safety net. Chloe came to us tonight desperate for help. She is in terrible trouble, and of course, our family is always ready to support her. Susan turned her head and motioned to my father. Richard reached into the inner pocket of his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick cream-colored envelope and a folded legal document. He handed them to Susan with a solemn nod. She turned back to me, holding the papers out like she was offering me a holy sacrament. "We are giving Chloe a check for $5,000 tonight," Susan announced to the crowd. "It is a fresh start. We are providing her with the funds she needs to get back on her feet and find a safe place for our grandson. In exchange, we are simply asking her to sign a standard family property agreement just to keep our assets completely separate and protect the investments we have built for Jessica and Brad. It is a very generous offer to help her out of her current crisis." The guests murmured in quiet approval. I could see them nodding at my parents' profound generosity. They thought Susan and Richard were saints. They thought they were sacrificing their own hard-earned money to save a daughter who refused to save herself. Susan stepped closer to me, pushing the documents directly into my chest. She held out a heavy, expensive gold pen. Her eyes locked onto mine, and beneath the fake, loving smile, I saw the cold, venomous threat burning in her stare. She was silently daring me to refuse. She was reminding me of the Child Protective Services threat she had made yesterday. She truly believed that putting me on the spot in front of a massive, wealthy audience would force me to fold. She thought I would be so deeply humiliated by her public speech that I would eagerly grab the $5,000 sign, the quitclaim deed, and run away to hide my immense shame. "Just sign the paper, Chloe," Susan whispered under her breath, her tone a razor-sharp hiss that only I could hear. "Sign it right now and take the money, or I swear I will make that phone call tomorrow morning and you will never see Leo again." I looked down at the documents in her hand. The top page was the quitclaim deed. It was a legally binding document that would permanently transfer all my rightful ownership of this multi-million-dollar estate directly into their names. It would sign away my grandfather's carefully planned legacy. It would sign away my son's future security. It would legally validate their massive bank fraud, leaving me completely responsible for the $300,000 home equity line of credit they had illegally forged in my name. I thought about my grandfather, William. I thought about how he had quietly slipped that old brass key into my hand all those years ago, telling me to never let them leave me out in the cold. I thought about the heavy rusted safe hidden in the basement, holding the absolute truth they had desperately tried to bury. I thought about my sweet, innocent son Leo, shivering in the back seat of my freezing car, because his own grandmother had decided he was not worth the trouble of opening a guest bedroom door. I slowly reached out and took the heavy legal paper from her hand. I took the gold pen. Susan let out a very quiet breath of absolute relief. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She turned her head slightly to shoot a triumphant glance at my father. Richard smiled proudly, puffing out his chest. Jessica and Brad exchanged a relieved, happy look by the fireplace. They all thought they had won. They thought they had successfully stolen my inheritance and funded their fake business with absolutely zero consequences. I did not uncap the pen. I held the thick quitclaim deed in both of my hands. I looked around the room, making deliberate eye contact with the senior pastor, with the wealthy investors, and finally with my mother. $5,000. I said, my voice perfectly calm, echoing clearly in the silent room. You are offering me a $5,000 check because you claim I am a homeless, troubled mother who cannot take care of her child. Chloe, please, Susan said, adopting her fake soothing tone again. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Just sign the agreement and we can get you the help you so desperately need. I do not need your help, Susan, I replied, dropping the word mom completely. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed from the guests. Susan flinched as if I had physically slapped her. Her eyes widened in genuine shock at my blatant refusal to play along with her script. I do not need $5,000. I continued, my voice rising in strength and absolute power, and I certainly do not need to sign a quitclaim deed transferring the ownership of this $5 million estate into your name. I gripped the top edge of the thick legal document. I looked my mother dead in the eyes. I saw the exact moment her false confidence shattered into pure, absolute terror. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The elegant mask she wore for her high society friends was slipping, rapidly revealing the panicked monster hiding just underneath. I pulled my hands apart in one swift, violent motion. The sound of the thick parchment tearing in half echoed like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet room. Susan gasped, stumbling backward. Richard let out a loud shout of anger, taking a sudden step toward me. I brought the two torn halves together and ripped them, again shredding the legal document into 4 jagged pieces. I held my hands out and let the shredded pieces of the quitclaim deed flutter down to the polished marble floor, landing directly on top of my mother's expensive designer shoes. "Have you lost your mind?" Richard roared, his face turning a dark, furious red. He completely abandoned his wealthy gentleman persona, lunging forward to grab my arm. "You ungrateful, wretched girl. How dare you come into my house and cause a scene in front of our guests?" I did not step back. I stood my ground, looking at his outstretched hand with pure disgust. "This is not your house, Richard," I said, my voice ringing with undeniable, absolute authority. "It has never been your house." The entire room erupted into frantic, confused whispers. The senior pastor looked deeply disturbed. Brad stepped away from the fireplace, his face paling as he looked between me and his wealthy investors. The investors themselves were staring at my father with sudden, sharp suspicion. "What are you talking about?" Susan cried out, trying desperately to regain control of the room. "Do not listen to her. She is unwell. She is completely delusional. She needs psychiatric help. Richard, call the police and have her removed immediately." "I would absolutely love for you to call the police." I fired back, pulling a separate thick manila folder from my leather tote bag. "In fact, they should be arriving very shortly. But they are not coming for me, Susan. They are coming for you." I held the folder high so every single person in the room could see the embossed legal seal of Jonathan Hayes' law firm on the cover. "For the last 2 years, you have been living a massive lie," I announced, turning my body so the entire crowd could hear my words. "You have told everyone in this room that you own this magnificent estate. You have hosted parties, you have bragged about your investments, and you have looked down your noses at anyone who had less than you. But you are nothing more than temporary caretakers. Grandfather William never left this house to you. He left it entirely to me." I opened the folder and pulled out the certified copy of the original deed of trust, holding it up for the room to see. "My 30th birthday passed 2 years ago," I continued, my voice echoing relentlessly. "On that exact day, the title of this property legally and automatically transferred to my name. You hid the documents in a broken safe in the basement, hoping I would never find out. You locked me and your 5-year-old grandson out in the freezing cold during a state of emergency because you thought I was too weak to ever fight back. Lies! Susan shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She is making all of this up. The house is ours. We have the paperwork to prove it. If the house is yours, I asked, taking a slow, deliberate step toward her, then why did you forge my signature 6 months ago to take out a $300,000 home equity line of credit? The silence that followed that sentence was absolute and completely deafening. No one breathed. No one moved. I turned my gaze directly to Brad. He was standing completely frozen by the fireplace, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. The wealthy investors standing next to him were now glaring at him with intense, furious scrutiny. You told these investors that Golden Horizon Realty was funded by the equity in this estate, I said, pointing directly at Brad. You told them you had $300,000 in initial seed money. You forgot to tell them that you obtained that money by committing massive federal bank fraud and identity theft against your own sister. That is not true. Brad stammered, his face completely drained of color. We did not. We would never. I pulled the bank records from my folder and threw them onto the marble floor, right next to the shredded pieces of the quitclaim deed. There are the wire transfer logs, I stated clearly. They show exactly how the stolen funds were moved from the fraudulent loan taken out in my forged name directly into your vanity business account. The bank has already been notified. The property title is officially frozen. Your corporate accounts are completely locked. And my attorney is currently waiting outside the community gates with the local authorities. Susan let out a loud, agonizing wail, dropping to her knees on the marble floor. She desperately scrambled to pick up the bank records, her hands shaking violently as she stared at the undeniable proof of her crimes. Richard simply stood there, his mouth hanging open, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence. His entire world, his entire identity built on stolen wealth and projected superiority, was crumbling into dust right in front of his eyes. The high society investors did not wait around to see how the night would end. They immediately began setting their champagne glasses down on the catered tables and making a rapid, aggressive exit toward the front doors. They shot looks of pure disgust at Brad and my father as they walked out, muttering angrily about notifying their own legal teams. The senior pastor looked at my parents with profound disappointment, shaking his head slowly before he too turned and walked out into the night. The lavish open house party, the grand celebration of their fake empire, was completely destroyed. The string quartet had quietly packed up their instruments and slipped out the back. The caterers had vanished into the kitchen. Within minutes, the massive grand foyer was entirely empty, except for me and the 4 people who had spent my entire life trying to break me. I looked down at my mother crying on the floor. I looked at my father staring blankly into space. I looked at Jessica and Brad clutching each other by the fireplace, their dreams of luxury and unearned wealth completely obliterated. I did not feel sorry for them. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I felt the incredible soaring weight of true, absolute justice. The curtain had been torn completely off, and the ugly, rotting truth was finally exposed to the light. The heavy oak front doors of the mansion swung open with a resounding thud that echoed through the paralyzing silence of the grand foyer. Everyone in the room turned their heads simultaneously. Walking through the entrance was Jonathan Hayes. He moved with the crisp, undeniable authority of a man who had spent decades dismantling the lies of arrogant people. He was wearing a sharp charcoal suit and carrying a thick leather briefcase that held the absolute destruction of my parents' fabricated empire. But Jonathan did not walk into the house alone. Flanking him on either side were 2 uniformed city police officers. Their heavy black boots stepped firmly onto the imported Italian marble floors, bringing the cold, harsh reality of the law directly into my mother's lavish high society party. Susan let out a high-pitched, breathless gasp and stumbled backward until her spine hit the edge of the grand staircase. Her hands flew to her mouth and her eyes darted frantically around the room to see if her wealthy friends were watching. They absolutely were. Every single remaining investor, church elder, and country club member was staring in total shock at the sight of armed law enforcement entering the private event. Richard immediately puffed out his chest and marched toward the front door, attempting to project the dominant patriarchal authority he had used to control me for 32 years. He pointed a trembling finger at Jonathan and demanded to know who he was and why he had the absolute audacity to bring police officers into his home. Jonathan did not even blink. He stopped in the center of the foyer and looked at my father with an expression of pure professional contempt. He introduced himself clearly and loudly, announcing that he was the senior estate attorney representing the true and absolute legal owner of the property. He stated my name, Chloe Elizabeth Myers. Richard scoffed loudly and tried to wave his hand as if he could simply dismiss the reality standing right in front of him. He told the officers that this was a private residence and a private family matter, and that his emotionally disturbed daughter was having a mental breakdown. He demanded that they escort me and my lawyer off his property immediately before he filed a lawsuit for trespassing. One of the police officers stepped forward and rested his hand casually on his utility belt. He looked Richard directly in the eye and stated that they were not there to escort anyone off the property. He explained that they were present in an official capacity to serve a court-ordered legal mandate and to ensure the peace was kept while the true property owner secured her assets. The officer looked at Richard and told him he needed to step back and listen very carefully to what the attorney had to say. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer weight of the police officer's command forced him to close it. He took a slow, defeated step backward. The entire facade of the wealthy self-made real estate mogul was rapidly melting off his face, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate old man who was finally out of options. Jonathan opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of certified legal documents. The papers were stamped with official county seals and bound in thick blue backing. He held the documents up and addressed my father and my mother. He told them that for the past 2 years, they had been living in this multi-million-dollar estate as nothing more than temporary conditional tenants. He explicitly detailed how my grandfather William had deliberately placed the deed into an irrevocable blind trust specifically designed to keep the asset completely out of their greedy hands. Jonathan announced to the entire room that upon my 30th birthday, the sole and absolute ownership of the property had transferred entirely to me. He looked at Susan and told her that her days of playing the wealthy lady of the manor were officially over. Susan began to cry. It was not the elegant, delicate weeping she used to garner sympathy from her church friends. It was a loud, ugly, hysterical sobbing. She clutched the railing of the staircase and cried out that it was not fair. She wailed that they had maintained the house, that they had paid the property taxes, and that they deserved to keep the home because they were the parents. She screamed that I was an ungrateful child who was trying to leave my own mother and father homeless on the street. I stepped forward, walking right past Jonathan and standing directly in front of my mother. I looked at her crying on the floor and I felt absolutely nothing. The well of sympathy I had reserved for my family had completely dried up. "You are crying about being homeless," I asked, my voice echoing clearly across the room. "You are crying because you might have to leave a luxury mansion. Just 3 nights ago, a natural disaster completely destroyed my apartment. I stood on this exact porch holding your 5-year-old grandson in my arms. We were freezing. We were terrified. I begged you for a blanket and a spot on the floor. And you looked at me and told me there was no room because Brad and Jessica needed the space for their luggage. You slammed the door and left a young mother and a little boy to sleep in a freezing car in your driveway. You do not get to cry about being homeless, Susan. You do not even know what that word means." The remaining guests in the room began to mutter in absolute disgust. A wealthy older woman who had been chatting with Susan just 10 minutes earlier covered her mouth in sheer horror, stepping far away from my mother. The illusion of the loving, selfless Christian family was completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. But the house was only the beginning of their nightmare. I turned my attention away from my sobbing mother and looked directly at my sister Jessica and her husband Brad. They were standing frozen by the fireplace, trapped behind the circle of high-net-worth investors they had been desperately trying to solicit for funds. Brad was sweating profusely. The collar of his expensive dress shirt was soaked, and his eyes were darting toward the back door looking for an escape route. I reached into my own canvas bag and pulled out the forged bank documents. I held the stack of papers high so the investors could see them clearly. My parents did not just hide the true ownership of this property, I announced to the room, ensuring every single investor heard my words. They used this house to commit massive federal bank fraud. 6 months ago, they forged my legal signature on a home equity line of credit. They went behind my back and illegally borrowed $300,000 against the equity of a home they did not own. They stole my identity and put a massive unpayable debt entirely in my name. They put my financial future and my son's future in absolute jeopardy. I walked directly over to the circle of investors. Brad tried to step in front of me, holding his hands up in a frantic, pleading gesture. He stammered and stuttered, begging me not to do this, begging me to keep this in the family. I ignored him completely and looked straight at a prominent local businessman who had been moments away from writing Brad a massive check. "Do you want to know where that stolen $300,000 went?" I asked the businessman, holding out the highlighted bank transfer records. It went directly into the primary business account of Golden Horizon Realty. The entire foundation of their company is built on stolen money. The seed capital Brad has been bragging about all night is the direct result of identity theft and bank fraud. They did not secure an angel investor. They committed a felony against a struggling single mother so they could buy a brand new luxury sports car and pretend to be successful entrepreneurs. The businessman took the papers from my hand and scanned the highlighted wire transfer logs. His face hardened into a mask of pure cold fury. He looked at the forged signature on the loan application and then looked at the business account routing numbers. The proof was absolute and completely undeniable. The businessman turned slowly to look at Brad. Brad shrank back against the stone fireplace, trembling like a frightened child. The investor reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a folded check. He had clearly written it out earlier in the evening, intending to hand it over to Brad as a major initial investment. The man held the check up, looking at Brad with a level of deep, profound contempt that words could barely describe. "You are nothing but a pathetic common thief," the businessman said, his voice low and dangerous. "You bring us into this home, you drink our wine, and you lie to our faces while you are actively robbing your own family blind. You sicken me." The businessman gripped the edges of the heavy paper check and tore it sharply in half. He placed the pieces together and tore them again and again until the check was nothing but tiny, worthless shreds of paper. He threw the pieces directly into Brad's face, letting them flutter down onto the expensive suit Brad had bought with my stolen money. The other investors in the circle immediately followed suit. One by one, they turned their backs on Brad and Jessica, muttering curses and promising to blacklist them from every single business circle in Southern California. They walked swiftly out the front door, shaking their heads in total disgust. Jessica let out a loud, agonizing scream, dropping to her knees next to her husband. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as her dreams of becoming a wealthy high-society real estate mogul vanished into the cold night air. The fake business was dead. Their reputation was completely destroyed. They were going to have to sell the Porsche just to pay for the criminal defense attorneys they were absolutely going to need. Jonathan Hayes stepped forward, holding the final piece of the legal puzzle. He walked directly over to my father, who was now leaning heavily against the grand staircase, looking incredibly old and completely broken. Jonathan handed Richard a thick sealed envelope. "That is a formal 30-day notice of eviction," Jonathan stated, his voice echoing in the nearly empty room. "You and your entire family have exactly 30 days to pack your personal belongings and vacate this premises permanently. If you remove a single fixture, if you damage a single wall, or if you attempt to steal any property that belongs to the estate, we will have you immediately arrested for vandalism and theft." Richard took the envelope with shaking hands, staring down at the bold black letters printed on the front. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading sorrow that I had never seen before. "Chloe, please," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "We have nowhere to go. We have no savings. We put everything we had into maintaining the image of this house. If you throw us out, we will have absolutely nothing. We will be ruined. I looked at the man who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a useless burden. I looked at the man who had called me a sick daughter, simply because I refused to conform to his twisted demands. I looked at the man who had willingly forged my name on a massive loan, perfectly content to let the bank destroy my life, while he drank fine wine in his stolen mansion. I felt a deep, immense sense of peace settle over my entire body. I did not feel angry anymore. The fiery rage that had propelled me through the last 48 hours had completely burned itself out, leaving behind a clear, cool, and perfectly rational calm. "You should have thought about that before you locked your grandson out in the freezing cold, Richard," I said, my voice soft but entirely unyielding. "You built your entire life on a foundation of lies and stolen money. Now, the bill has finally come due. You have 30 days to figure it out. I suggest you start packing tonight." I turned my back on my weeping parents and my devastated sister. I did not say another word to them. I simply walked across the grand foyer, walking right past the torn shreds of the quitclaim deed and the pieces of the ruined investment check. I walked out the massive double doors and stepped into the cool, crisp California night air. Jonathan Hayes followed close behind me, offering a small, proud smile before walking toward his own car. The two police officers remained inside the house to ensure my parents fully understood the severe legal boundaries that had just been firmly established. I walked down the long cobblestone driveway toward my dusty 10-year-old Honda Civic. It was the exact same car I had slept in just a few days ago, but tonight it felt like a golden chariot. I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel with hands that were completely steady. I drove out of the wealthy, gated community, leaving the mansion and the miserable people inside it far behind me. I drove back toward the safe, bright rental house where my little boy was sleeping peacefully. My parents were going to lose everything. The bank fraud investigators were already reviewing the files Jonathan had submitted. The criminal charges for identity theft were inevitable. They were going to lose their fake wealth, their social status, and their freedom. But I had gained absolutely everything. I had reclaimed my grandfather's love. I had secured a beautiful, massive home for my son. I had completely destroyed the generational cycle of abuse that had plagued my family for decades. I was finally free, and for the first time in my entire 32 years of life, I was exactly the person I was always meant to be. If you are listening to this right now, and you are trapped in a family that makes you feel small, invisible, or worthless, please hear my words. You do not have to accept the role they force upon you. You do not owe your loyalty to people who continuously abuse your kindness. Sometimes, the people who share your blood are the exact people you need to protect yourself against. Stand up for yourself. Gather your evidence. Build your boundaries with absolute iron. Do not ever let them convince you that you are crazy or dramatic for demanding the respect you inherently deserve. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel if my story resonated with you, and drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. You have the power to write your own ending. Never let anyone take that pen out of your hand. Keep fighting and take care of yourself. You are worth it. The morning after the disastrous open house party, the reality of their absolute ruin finally settled over my parents like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ash. For my entire life, Richard and Susan had meticulously crafted an illusion of impenetrable wealth and superior morality. They believed their carefully constructed image would forever protect them from the consequences of their unimaginable cruelty. But the truth had a way of tearing through the strongest illusions, and the destruction of their fake empire was absolutely biblical. The very first casualty of their downfall was their relationship with their precious golden child. Jessica and Brad had spent years happily feeding off my parents' stolen prosperity. They had eagerly accepted the brand new cars, the expensive vacations, and the fraudulent $300,000 business loan without ever once questioning where the money came from. But the exact second the bank fraud investigators froze their corporate accounts, and the sheer magnitude of my parents' criminal liability became public knowledge, Jessica and Brad completely severed ties. It was a stunning display of the exact same heartless self-preservation my parents had taught them. When Richard and Susan desperately needed their favorite daughter to help them pack their belongings and navigate the terrifying legal labyrinth they had created, Jessica simply stopped answering their phone calls. Brad changed his phone number entirely to avoid being associated with my father during the ongoing federal bank fraud investigation. They packed up whatever designer clothes and luxury goods they could carry and fled to a cheap rental in another state, leaving Richard and Susan completely abandoned to face the music entirely alone. The poetic justice of that abandonment was something I could never have scripted better myself. My mother had spent 32 years treating me like an unwanted burden while worshiping the ground Jessica walked on. She had literally locked her own grandson out in the freezing cold just to ensure Jessica had a comfortable room for her luggage. And when the walls finally closed in, the daughter she had sacrificed everything for threw her aside like yesterday's trash without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. The social fallout within their elite community was even more devastating. Richard had spent decades climbing the ranks of the church council, using his perceived wealth to buy influence and unearned respect from the congregation. But word of the fraudulent loan and the stolen inheritance spread through the wealthy neighborhood with the speed of a wildfire. By Monday morning, the senior pastor requested a private meeting with my father. Richard was formally and unceremoniously asked to step down from the church council entirely. His membership at the exclusive local country club was quietly but permanently revoked. The people they had spent their entire lives trying to impress now looked at them with complete, absolute disgust. They were no longer the generous, wealthy pillars of the community. They were exposed as common thieves who had actively tried to ruin their own struggling daughter. With the 30-day eviction notice hanging over their heads and a massive bank fraud investigation rapidly draining their meager hidden savings, my parents were forced to face a brutal new reality. The luxurious $5 million estate was no longer theirs to occupy. The sheriff department made it incredibly clear that if they did not vacate the premises by the designated deadline, they would be physically removed and arrested for trespassing. They had absolutely no choice but to pack their remaining possessions into cheap cardboard boxes. They could no longer afford the upscale neighborhoods they used to boast about. With the looming legal fees and the absolute destruction of their credit score, they were forced to sign a lease on a tiny, cramped two-bedroom apartment in a rundown, noisy suburb an hour away from the city. It was the exact kind of modest, struggling neighborhood they had spent their entire lives mercilessly mocking. The supreme irony of Richard and Susan carrying their own heavy boxes up 3 flights of concrete stairs to a dingy apartment with peeling paint was the ultimate consequence of their lifelong greed. They had tried to leave me homeless, and now they were trapped in a miserable situation entirely of their own making. When the 30 days finally expired, I drove back to the mansion to officially reclaim my grandfather's legacy. Jonathan Hayes met me at the front gate, accompanied by a local locksmith. We walked through the heavy double doors into the massive foyer, and the silence that greeted us was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The toxic, suffocating energy that had plagued this house for decades was completely gone. My parents were gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner, and absolutely full of endless possibility. I walked through the sprawling rooms, tracing my fingers along the rich mahogany woodwork, chalk, and the cool marble countertops. This was no longer a prison of emotional abuse. It was my sanctuary. It was the powerful, secure foundation Grandfather William had always intended for me to have. I hired a professional cleaning crew to completely scrub the entire estate from top to bottom. I wanted every single trace of Susan and Richard completely eradicated from the property. We threw open all the massive glass windows, letting the fresh, crisp California ocean breeze sweep through the long hallways. We removed the heavy, dark curtains my mother had always kept drawn and let the brilliant golden sunlight flood into every single room. The mansion literally felt like it was finally taking a deep breath of fresh air after being suffocated for years. But the absolute best part of reclaiming my home was designing the perfect space for Leo. During the years of my parents' occupation, the largest, most beautiful guest bedroom had been reserved exclusively for Jessica's occasional visits. It featured massive bay windows, a beautiful window seat, and a gorgeous view of the lush green backyard. That room became my primary focus. I spent days carefully painting the walls a cheerful bright blue. I bought a sturdy, comfortable bed with the softest blankets I could find to make sure he would never, ever feel the terrible, biting cold again. I filled the room with plenty of sunshine and an abundance of wonderful toys. I set up a massive wooden train table in the center of the room and lined the heavy oak bookshelves with dozens of colorful storybooks. I hung glowing stars on the ceiling so he would always have a light to guide him in the dark. When I finally brought Leo into the house and showed him his new bedroom, the look of pure, unadulterated joy on his sweet face completely melted my heart. He ran his little hands over the soft blankets and gasped in pure amazement at the giant train table. He looked up at me with his big, innocent eyes and asked if we really got to stay here forever. I knelt down on the soft, clean carpet, wrapped my arms tightly around him, and promised him that nobody would ever make us leave. That night, as I tucked Leo into his warm, comfortable bed and turned on his small nightlight, I walked out into the quiet hallway and let out a long, peaceful exhale. I walked down the grand staircase and stood in the beautifully lit living room. I did not feel the constant crushing anxiety of unpaid bills anymore. I did not feel the terrifying looming threat of homelessness or the heavy dark cloud of my parents' emotional manipulation. I was no longer the frightened 15-year-old girl wandering in a freezing storm. I was a strong, fiercely independent woman who had successfully fought a massive war against incredible odds and emerged completely victorious. For the absolute first time in my entire 32 years of life, I looked around at the solid, beautiful walls surrounding me, and I finally felt like I truly belonged in a place called home. If you are watching this right now, I want you to remember something incredibly important. I want you to listen very carefully to these words, because they are the exact words I desperately needed to hear when I was sitting in my freezing car, terrified and completely alone. Setting boundaries with toxic family members is not betrayal. It is survival. For so many years, society tells us that blood is thicker than water, and that family is the most important thing in the world, regardless of how they treat you. We are conditioned from birth to forgive the unforgivable, to swallow our pride, and to continuously offer second chances to people who absolutely do not deserve them. We are taught to be the bigger person to keep the peace and to sacrifice our own mental and physical well-being just to maintain the illusion of a happy family. But you are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep someone else warm. You do not owe your loyalty to people who continuously abuse your kindness. You do not owe your silence to people who actively try to destroy your future to cover up their own terrible mistakes. If the people who share your DNA treat you like a burden, if they belittle your accomplishments, if they steal your peace, and if they show zero remorse for the profound damage they cause, then you have every single right in the universe to walk away from them permanently. Do not let anyone ever make you feel guilty for protecting your own peace. Do not let manipulative relatives use your empathy as a weapon against you. Your life belongs entirely to you. Your success belongs entirely to you. You have the absolute power to rewrite your own ending and build a beautiful, safe sanctuary far away from the darkness they tried to drown you in. It takes an immense amount of courage to stand up to the people who raised you. It is terrifying to face the unknown and risk being called the villain in their heavily distorted version of reality. But I promise you that the absolute freedom waiting for you on the other side of that fear is worth every single tear you shed along the way. You deserve to sleep in a warm, safe bed. You deserve to build a life filled with brilliant sunshine and genuine joy. If this story resonates with you today, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your life. Your support helps bring these incredibly important messages to other people who might be suffering in silence right now, needing the exact same encouragement to finally break free. I would also absolutely love to know where you are joining from today. Drop your city and state and the current time in the comments below. We are never truly alone in these battles. Remember, you deserve to be safe and you deserve to be valued. You are stronger than the people who tried to break you. Keep standing tall, keep fighting for your peace, and never ever apologize for demanding the respect you inherently deserve. See you in the next story.